This world, as we know it, was created by Big News Morgans, and we didn't even know that he existed until over 860 chapters into the series. There is no other character in One Piece with more power than Morgans. There is no one else who can crown a pirate king, cause a God Valley incident, and create the worst generation as we know them. Big News Morgans is the closest thing that One Piece has to an in-world author, and his presence is felt as early as East Blue, as it was a news coup who carried Luffy's first bounty, after Nami complained about the World Economic Journal raising their prices, greedy bird. This seems rather innocent and, dare I say, quirky at the time, but what it displayed is that Morgans has a reach so far and wide to be able to stick his bird hand into the very sticks of East Blue. And this reach is because Morgans has domain over the sky. There's only a rare few who have access to the sky, like the scientists of Weatheria or Shiki when he is Canon with his float powers, and the world government certainly has no dominion in the sky, meaning that Morgans practically has a monopoly of this sky communication network. And as a result, everybody, and I mean everybody, reads the World Economic Journal. Civilians, pirates, revolutionaries, marines, emperors, etc., which means that almost everyone sees the world through the lens that Big News Morgans creates. I may be a money-hungry Scrooge, but first and foremost, I'm a journalist. As the DJ of the printed page, I get people's hearts dancing, and I'm the one who decides what news is fit to print. And Morgans describing himself as a DJ is perfect. DJing is, I think, seen as quite a lazy profession, and some DJs are pretty lazy. I mean, how much easier could life be than just hitting a play button and starting the musics? But there is so much more to it than that. A good DJ doesn't just whack a playlist together. A good DJ has to be able to read the hearts and minds of the crowd, to match their energy, hit the right highs at the right time, and to create a seamless journey through music. That is exactly what Morgans does with the printed page, and on a much more massive scale than any DJ could ever accomplish, because Morgans has to be able to read the hearts and minds of the entire planet. And to give you but a taste of the terror that Morgans has unleashed, we should go ahead and start right at the beginning. The very first page of One Piece, the famous words of wealth, fame, power, the description of Roger as the Pirate King, Gold Roger I should say. These are the most famous words in the entire series, and they were written by Big News Morgans, which we would not discover until chapter 968, where Rayleigh is reading the World Economic Journal, and Morgan's article is saying, "The man who achieved wealth, fame, and power. The Pirate King, Gold Roger." And it's not just the iconic wealth, fame, and power line, because just let this sink in, Morgans is also the one who chose to give Roger the title of Pirate King, something that even Roger is surprised by. He says, "Hey, that's Gold D, Roger, but I gotta say, Pirate King, it has a nice ring to it," confirming that this is a new term to Roger. It's not an idea that anyone was actively seeking until Roger found Laugh Tale and became the first known person to successfully circumnavigate the globe. And Morgan, sensing that this could stir the hearts and minds of the people, he gave Roger a rewarding title, something that the world had never heard or considered until Morgans printed it. And those two words, Pirate King, are now the driving force of each and every seriously active pirate to this very day. And one can argue that Morgans is every bit as responsible for the golden age of piracy as Roger was, because the Marines may have given Roger his execution platform, but Morgans gave Roger's ideology a platform. And not only that, but he was able to mold it into a very concise two-word mantra that would fuel the coming decades. However, the reason why Morgans used gold instead of gold was likely a concession made to the world government. As in an example that we'll explore in a bit, Morgans was asked to remove the D from Luffy's name, which he did not, and we'll get to that. But to step back a bit, the first time that the world seems to have encountered the unfathomable power of Big News Morgans was 38 years ago during the God Valley incident. In fact, not during, just before it. As a tech-savvy slave girl named Ginny was able to transmit information about the prizes of the native hunting contest that would shortly take place on the island. These prizes include wildly rare devil fruit such as Kaido and Kuma's future abilities, but most importantly, the grand prize, Shaki, a former empress of Amazon Lily, whose life would be awarded to the winner of the contest. This information was of the utmost importance to keep secret, as if Shaki's location was revealed, then it would result in retaliatory action by both the Rocks pirates and the Roger pirates, the two most powersome pirate crews at the time, as Shaki was a precious inhabitant of Hachinosu, the island governed by Roxy Zebek, and she was also the love interest of Roger's first mate Silver's Ray Lee, an imagined love interest of Roger himself. Ginny was hoping that her transmission would reach the entire world, and then to inspire an untold quantity of pirates to flock to the island to cause all sorts of chaoses. However, this transmission was only heard by two groups. The first was Cypherpol, the secret police of the world government, and they were probably not going to broadcast it. But the second was a 15-year-old bird boy named Morgans, not quite yet of big news notoriety, but after this he would skyrocket into global relevance. Morgans then did something rather scummy, which was that he contacted Cypherpol in an attempt to extort them for some sweet, sweet cash money. An attempt that I believe was successful, and that sum of money is likely what allowed Morgans to buy the capital and hire a legion of birds to fully establish his newspaper business. But because this is Morgans, there's a twist here. Regardless of whether or not the world government paid him, Morgans still leaked this information directly to Hachinosu. Likely because Morgans wanted some big news to print by orchestrating a scenario where the Rocks pirates attacked God Valley. But also this showed some very early signs of advanced schemings from this Birdman, because leaking this information to Hachinosu, the pirate paradise, was also the fastest, most effective way to spread the information to all corners of the pirating world, which not only got Rocks involved, but also got Roger involved, and Roger's presence got Garp involved, which created an incident that would change the world as we know it. The God Valley incident had a litany of historical moving pieces that were integral to its chaos, but there is arguably no single person more individually responsible for this event than Big News Morgans. Without him, it just doesn't happen. The native hunting contest goes smoothly, and you know what, Roxy Zebek might even still be alive today, and we are looking at a completely different world. But Morgans leaked the information because he read the hearts of the world, remembering that Shaki was an idol so treasured by the planet at large that her disappearance initially halted all global economic activity for several weeks. So Morgans read this spherical room, and the way to win the hearts of his readers was to present a story about a bold rescue attempt of Shaki. And so that is what Morgans put into action. Although in the end, the world would never learn the truth of the God Valley incident, and the island itself, along with any trace of Roxy Zebek, would be successfully erased from history. Meaning that Morgans at this point did see it in his best interest to play along with the world government narrative. And to be fair, that also resulted in a great story as well. Instead of what actually happened, Morgans was able to publish the birth of Garp the hero, with his operation playing an integral role in creating the legend behind a man who is now widely considered to be the greatest Marine to have ever lived. But regardless of what the world knew about the actual truth, Morgans did still spark the God Valley incident. And so he changed the world through the means of information distribution. And as time went on, Morgans would either cooperate or rebel against the world government, depending on what it is that he thought would stir people's hearts the most. And a great case of cooperation would be the comic strip Sora, Warrior of the Sea, a World Economic Journal original project that used Germa 66, a fictional real-life monarchy that dominated North Blue as their villains, but also as veto of the fire tank pirate states. From what I hear, the story was based on the true exploits of heroes within the Marines. In other words, it was propaganda for kids. So this comic was designed to make the Marines look so good that kids would grow up and enlist, and Morgans was probably paid quite a bit for this propaganda. And this was world government propaganda designed specifically to secure the North Blue, to inspire people to join the Marines rather than support Germa. And this comic had such a profound effect that every male of a certain age from North Blue knows it, which is why characters like Trafalgar Law recognize Sanji's raid suit immediately as the stealth black character. And to prove that the propaganda did its job, Law stated that everyone in North Blue knows the series and that he hated those filthy Germa villains. And after Sanji uses his powers to spy in the women's baths on Wano, Diaz Drake and Basil Hawkins, who both also grew up in North Blue, instantly recognize Stealth Black as well, which shows us something rather sinister about the distribution of information. I think it's often assumed that there is only one edition of the World Economic Journal printed, because we tend to see people from all around the world reading it at the same time. However, the Sora comic strip was only printed in North Blue, which was done in an effort to undermine the German kingdom and to glorify the world government. So this was very localized propaganda, and it shows that each blue, the Grand Line, the Calm Belt, and maybe even the New World, all likely have these subtle differences in addition to carrying the universal big news. And that universal big news often includes new bounties. Bounty numbers are decided by the Marines, often calculated personally by Commodore brand new, but what isn't decided by the Marines are the photos that are printed alongside the bounties. Morgan's has a particular aesthetic authority that gives him an unparalleled power to portray these criminals in any way that he sees fit. He can make them look scary, he can make them look sympathetic, he can make them look heroic, he can make them look outright stupid, he can make them look like pets, like Chopper. And so having the choice of which image gets printed alongside the number is extremely powerful. And that is a large part of what has been Morgan's greatest project since crowning Roger as the Pirate King. For the past few years, Big News Morgans has been focusing on the next generation, as he stated to Stussy during Whole Cake Island. The way I see it, Stussy, in the near future, one of the worst generation is going to rise to claim the mantle of the Pirate King, which seems like a pretty bold prediction, but it becomes a lot less bold when you realize that Morgans is the one who gets to stack this deck and played a colossal part in creating the worst generation to begin with. Firstly, just like the Pirate King title, Morgans is almost certainly the one who coined the worst generation title as well, and the 11 supernovas, as they were originally known. We as readers called them the 11 supernovas at the time because that was the title of chapter 498. However, that term, which is also sometimes translated as super rookies, isn't used in world until after the Sabadi incident. Before then, they're just referred to as the 11 rookies with bounties over 100 million berries. Everyone on Sabadi knew enough to define them as a group, but they haven't been told what to call them or how to feel about them, because that is a job for Bird. Kid, Luffy, Hawkins, Drake, Law, you must have heard these names in the news. Information is a weapon. That quote was said by Shaki, who once had the entire world revolving around her, but Shaki only knows these names because she follows the news, not because she actually has any involvement in piracy anymore. So a large part of Shaki's worldview is now shaped by the choices of Morgan's. And a major part of why Shaki was such a big fan of Luffy before she even met him was because the reporting on Eustace Kid portrayed him as being too violent. And not a lot of fans actually know this, mostly because this was decided very retroactively, but Pre-Time Skip One Piece has an official name. The first half of the series is called Sea of Survival, Super Rookie Saga. Super Rookies again being the more literal translation of what we know as in English as the supernovas, meaning that Morgans named all of Pre-Time Skip One Piece. And in case you're curious, the second half of the series also has an official name, which is The Final Sea, the New World Saga, which I will say doesn't quite have the same zing to it, and I think that Oda may have wanted to consult with Morgans on that one. But in this way, Morgans almost acts as a casting director. He can't control the actions of the pirates, but he can artificially raise their infamy and give them more opportunities to act further, or to manipulate others into acting against them, to create fun storylines. Such as after Whole Cake Island, when Morgans, who was present at the time, wrote about Luffy's quote, victory over Big Mom, which made Charlotte Lin so furious that she very unwisely decided to set sail to Wano in order to get revenge on Luffy and to re-establish her dominance in the world. Morgans deliberately poked that very big mother, as so many have, hence all the children, but it's because Morgans wanted to spark another conflict to write more big news about. Meanwhile, reading that same article also had an effect on Kobe, who was brought to tears reading about the actions that Luffy sort of but didn't really carry out, because they were heavily embellished by Morgans. However, this inspired Kobe to keep on working and become better than he is in order to keep up with Luffy, because this is what a good bird-based storyteller does. He doesn't just create the hero, but Morgans is also creating antagonists and rivals for Luffy to collide with, and this whole endeavor has become one big audition process for Morgans to find his next Pirate King. And to continue with Morgans and his gift for creating striking titles, following Whole Cake Island, Morgans was also the one who labeled Luffy as the 5th Emperor of the Sea, which is a title that many in-world figures took issue with, and no one except for Morgans would have given Luffy this title at that stage in his career. But the way that Morgans framed it was that Luffy had just come out victorious in a direct assault on Big Mom. He successfully made it look like Luffy was already competing on the level of an Emperor of the Sea, which both we and Morgans knew was far from true. But here's the thing, Morgans has his own form of Gear 5th abilities, where he gets to reshape reality as he sees fit through his words. And it would only be a few weeks after this that Morgans would have the pleasure of crowning Luffy as an official 4th Emperor, in addition to Buggy, of course. But it's not just the world of piracy that Morgans has his eyes on. He's also following the Revolutionary Army much more closely than anyone else, and it can be argued that his reporting on them often serves to inspire other nations to revolt against their monarchies news to create more big news for Morgans to report on. And this dates all the way back to the very first appearance of the World Economic Journal in chapter 96, which featured a story about a successful coup d'etat having occurred on the island of Vera. And recently, Morgans did one very impactful thing for the Revolutionary Army, as following the reverie, Morgans was given a letter from the world government by Attach, a former world government photographer, containing a check with a bribe from the world government, asking him to cover up a particular story, which is very cool because in retrospect, this was a relationship established by Morgans extorting them on God Valley, but on this occasion, Morgans refused the bribe. And the story he was likely asked to cover up was the murder of Nefertari Cobra, with the alleged murderer being Revolutionary Army Chief of Staff Sabo. And it's in chapter 1054 that Kurouma comments on how this murder was so meaningful to the Revolutionary Army because Cobra was a Nefertari, one of the 20 founding families of the world government. We know that Sabo didn't kill Cobra, but it doesn't matter because the world now believes he does, which is considered to be the single biggest victory attained by the Revolutionary Army to date. Their movement is bigger, faster, and most importantly, more newsier than ever before. And it's primarily thanks to these choices being made by Morgans. But the impact of Morgans cannot be understated even when it's not his intention. For example, Luffy's 3D2Y message was only possible to create by using Morgans' network. A very wise former first mate and a very wise former warlord of the sea knew that if they created some tantalizingly big news, then Luffy's message would spread. And furthermore, the signal for the Eight Nation Revolution to commence was to hear that Sabo and the Revolutionary Army had destroyed the hoof of the Celestial Dragons, which was unknowingly facilitated by Morgans, who could not resist reporting on more big news. So it's not so much that Morgans is some omniscient story lord, and he can be used by anyone wise enough to understand how he operates, but surprisingly few people on this planet seem to be capable of doing that, least of all the world government, who really need to be. And for an example of this, following the raid on Onigashima, Morgans was ordered to print a new 3 billion berry bounty for Luffy. However, Morgans was also told to remove the D from Luffy's name and to not use the photo that Guernica took of Luffy's new Gear 5th form. And to these commands, the great and mighty Bird said, "I won't let them manipulate this narrative. At moments like these, when the world is in flux, the straight facts are the most fascinating news there is." And there's even this panel of St. Topman Warcury losing his shit and demanding that the bounties be halted and reprinted. He is adamant that this image cannot get out into the world. And it's in this moment where we realize that even a man known as the world's greatest authority cannot command big news Morgans. This panel, quite frankly, is pathetic. Warcury looks pathetic. And Morgans may not realize this, but this decision has just revealed the sun god Nika to the entire planet. Anyone remaining who knows of the Nika legend has immediately recognized what Luffy is, just as the Giants of Elbaf did, but who knows how many other people there are on this planet who were patiently waiting for Nika to re-emerge and have now just seen him, and what they may be inspired to do from here. Morgans isn't all-powerful. He cannot create something from nothing. He can, however, significantly amplify or dampen whatever he sees fit. He has the power to sway the hearts and minds of the world, which is scarily close to the whole idea behind the sun god Nika. And whether Luffy becomes known as the world's greatest hero or the world's greatest villain will ultimately be in the hands of Morgans, who has flat out categorized Luffy as a villain at times, such as the Egghead incident where Luffy was blamed for invading and holding Vegapunk hostage, and likely his death as well. And the reason why Morgans did this was because of Shaki logic. Vegapunk was a beloved figure all over the world, so Morgans read those hearts and he needed to create a sinister villain to enhance the tragedy of Vegapunk's passing. However, if Morgans is just as in tune with the hearts of his readers as he's shown to be so far, then I think he'll be one of the first to realize that the dawn of the world is coming. He may have caused the God Valley incident, crowned the Pirate King, and created the worst generation, but the biggest news of his lifetime is still yet to be published. In chapter 1158, Mr. Eiichiro Oda jumped into his B-52 and dropped a bombshell on our poor unsuspecting mind brains with the revelation of the heroic pirate of justice, Kozuki Moria. Not Odin, not Momonosuke, Moria. And not only that, but Oda revealed the grave of this Kozuki Moria, which conjures questions, so many questions. And also images like this one of Moria doing the white guy in kimono meme. name. Me when I say Shichibukai instead of Warlord. But even before this revelation, Moria had stronger ties to Wano than most people, including myself, picked up on at the time, as Wano was an existence that essentially started to take form during Thriller Bark. In fact, Wano is first mentioned in chapter 450 by Dr. Hogback, who was describing Ryuma, the zombified remains of Wano's greatest of heroes. Oda was thinking about Wano all the way back then, because he had no idea just how long it would take to finally get there. And so Moria was also tied into setting Wano up through his family name. Let me explain. Our first clue can be found on the grave of Kozuki Moria itself. The official Viz translation elected to keep the name in Japanese, which I think was the right thing to do. The scans translated the name on the grave into English, and that was the wrong thing to do, because how Moria's name is written tells us quite a shocking amount of the story. And I would assume that most of you watching this video are seasoned weebs, but for those who are not, Japanese has 3 alphabets: hiragana, katakana, and kanji. Kanji are the funky characters, hiragana is the phonetic script for native Japanese words, and katakana is the phonetic script for foreign words and other assorted uses, meaning that you can write the same thing in 3 different ways, with those 3 different ways implying different meanings. Now, on the grave, Moria's name is written in both kanji and hiragana. The Kozuki part is in kanji and the Moria part is in hiragana, which is curious to me because Gecko Moria's name is written in neither of those. It is fully written in katakana, Gecko Moria. That part there, that's not so unusual. In fact, almost every One Piece character's name and names of places are written in katakana with a couple of exceptions, and that's mostly the characters and places in Wano. Kinemon, for example, is written with a combination of kanji and hiragana because that is Oda's linguistic standard. There is an in-world Japan, and in that country they use the script for native Japanese. However, everywhere else in the One Piece world uses the script for foreign words. And if I, man on the internet, was to offer a meta explanation for this, I personally think that part of it is to make One Piece as accessible as possible to everyone of all ages by actively trying not to include too much complex kanji. But on this grave, Moria, his name is written as if he was a Wano native, and his history is expanded on further with the cover of chapter 1154, where Yamato and newfound friends of Yamato go to pay their respects to the grave of the hero born in the West Blue and raised in Ringo. Kozuki Moria fellow, he's not just a name, he has some established history on Wano, specifically in Ringo. And this is something that Eiichiro Oda has been very, very clever with. Moria's alleged family name Gecko, whilst written in katakana, can also be translated into the following kanji, which are the symbols for moon and light together, meaning moonlight. Very lovely. But if these 2 kanji look familiar to you, then mate, they absolutely should, because these 2 kanji are also used to form the name Kozuki. All you need to do is flip them around and what is this? Kozuki. And so the hypothesis from here is that at some point, for some reason which we will explore, a man once known as Kozuki Moria took on the pseudonym of Gecko Moria, and to complete his Clark Kent transformation, he reversed the kanji in his name from Kozuki to Gecko and then wrote it in katakana instead of kanji so that no one would suspect that he hails from the land of samurai. Why did Mr. Moria do this? I have one key idea, which comes to us from chapter 986, where Kaido threatens to execute Momonosuke unless he renounces the Kozuki family name, which Momonosuke doesn't. He exclaims his name proudly and states that he will become the Shogun of Wano, which he did in record time, I might say. It was only a couple of hours after this and then just Momonosuke aged 20 years and became Shogun. But not everyone has Momonosuke's bravery and willpower in the face of death, and I can see a situation where after Moria was defeated by Kaido on Wano, Kaido posed the same choice to Moria. Either renounce the Kozuki name or be executed, with Moria selecting the latter and taking on the Gecko name instead. Not only leaving the Kozuki name behind all the way over there, but converting his full name into katakana to renounce any Wano heritage whatsoever. And if so, it could be argued that Kozuki Moria did indeed die that day because Moria, well, he abandoned himself. His spirit was broken, and he became the lingering sack of broken doorknobs that we know him as today. Jumping straight into that is getting a bit ahead of ourselves though, because we essentially have 3 options here. Firstly, Kozuki Moria is a blood relative of the Kozuki clan. Secondly, Kozuki Moria was adopted into the Kozuki clan. And option number, the third one, this is all a big mistake, and someone accidentally misspelled Moria's name while he was on Wano, leading to generational confusion. At this stage, none of these can be completely ruled out. Moria's lineage, it is quite perplexing. According to what we already knew, he was a child born in West West Blue, but according to the Grave, he ended up in the New World at some point. And not just any old New World, no, he ended up on Wano, by far one of the most difficult islands to reach. And to start by making the blood relative argument, Lunapianat made a great video, which will be linked in the description, with this video detailing how family structures worked in feudal Japan, as well as how they do work to this day on Wano, which is that, say, a daimyo had 3 sons. The eldest son would rightfully become heir of the main family, whilst the other 2 sons would splinter off and form branch families. So they still carry the same family name, but they are distinctly separate from the main house. And this is also explored in a ton of other anime, like Jujutsu Kaisen, Naruto, others. Can't think of any others at the moment, but there are them. And this is almost certainly what happened with Shimotsuki Kozaburo, who started his branch family in East Blue, founding Shimotsuki Village, while Shimotsuki Ushimaru would have inherited the main family, and also Shimotsuki Yasuie would have been from their generation as well. And his branch of the Shimotsuki family governed over the Hakumai region of Wano. So following that line of logic, it is possible that the Kozuki family also had branches, and maybe one of those branches ended up in West Blue, eventually creating a Kozuki Moria. That, or the branch family renamed itself to Gecko for whatever reason. Maybe it had something to do with some sort of void century persecution. The world government, the newly formed world government, they were on the lookout for samurai sounding people, and the Kozuki clan were all like, alright, Gecko it is. And that does answer one question, but it poses another. It answers the question of why Moria would eventually go to Wano as a child, because some sort of event happened, we'll explore that in a bit as well, and the only home that he had to go back to may have been his ancestral home. However, the new question that it asks would be, is Moria a blood relative of the Kozuki clan? And if so, why does he look nothing like anyone else who's ever existed? Not just on Wano either, anyone else in the whole world. Gecko Moria is a notoriously horny man, quite literally. Bro has straight up devil horns, which could indicate that he has some relation to the ancient giants, which do seem to have had a presence on or around Wano at some stage, due to the colossal Onigashima skull and the deep thematic connection that the Oni race seem to share with Wano for currently unknown reasons. And this might be a more recent cultural development, but Wano does have a history of not taking too kindly to strange-looking fellas. As shown in chapter 963, where child Nekomamushi, Inuarashi, and Kawamatsu are strung up and almost burned at the stake. So let's say that a Kozuki is born that demonstrates these out of the ordinary traits. And rather than stay on Wano, Moria's ancestors chose to become a branch family, and in the wise words of the Pet Shop Boys, go west. Although funnily enough, we do have potential evidence of a Kozuki branch settlement. However, it exists not in the west, but in the east. In East Blue, Usopp's home of Syrup Village happens to be located on the Gecko Islands, which is spelled the exact same way as Moria's katakana family name. So using the Shimotsuki logic of just slapping your name on a piece of land, it tracks that the Kozuki/Gecko clan could have done the same. Lunapianat also goes so far as to speculate that the Shimotsuki branch went to East Blue intentionally in order to track down the Kozuki family line. And the reason for this is because the Kozuki family were having succession issues. The shogun prior to Oden's father, Sukiyaki, at one point had no heir, which was making the entire nation rather restless. That is until the miraculous birth of Sukiyaki, but even then the line of succession made it was dangerously thin. And so the Shimotsuki expedition may have set out, illegally I should add, to recover any potential branch family Kozuki members, which led them to the Gecko Islands. However, by then the family could have fractured or moved further, with Moria's pod ending up in West Blue for reasons. And Moria's presence does fit pretty well into this worrisome time period, because Sukiyaki only had a single child as well, Kozuki Oden, who was only 9 years older than Moria. And Oden was such a terror that it was deemed early on that he would be unfit for leadership and could never become shogun. And so we had succession problems all over again, especially because Sukiyaki went so far as to disown him, meaning that Kozuki Sukiyaki for a time legally had no children and theoretically no successor. Now Oden did very eventually mature into someone who could have inherited that role, but that took a couple of decades. And in the meantime, out of sheer desperation, any link to the Kozuki heritage could have been sought out in the wider world, resulting in bringing Kozuki Moria to Wano. And in an extremely weird and wonderful timeline, Moria could have become the shogun of Wano. So that's fun, but let's go ahead and complicate things even further. As of chapter 1159, there is now a theory that Gecko Moria was born on God Valley, and that he was one of the slaves the world nobles used during the a native hunting contest, as various men on the internet across the world believe they have spotted a child Moria being shot by tranquilizer guns, along with what I guess would be his mother and sister in this panel, the suspiciously Sindri looking like people, and also his father in the previous panel, who did not look like Sindri. And usually I don't go for these kind of background character theories. At most, I tend to find them mildly interesting before moving on with my life. For example, another background character theory that comes from the God Valley incident is that this master of ceremonies is holding Mihawk's sword Yoru, and that this teeny tiny holy knight on the left here is Mihawk because that squiggle looks kinda like his hat. Which, I don't know, could potentially work because Mihawk would have only been 5 years old at the time, so we'll see how that turns out. But in general, Oda's squiggles often spark unintended outcomes. However, I am very much willing to entertain Child Moria here because the hairstyle, it is so incredibly distinct. And we have seen Oda draw a picture of a slightly older but still child Gecko Moria with this very similar hair. And I want to say that Oda doesn't just draw random children with hair this distinct, so I will. Oda doesn't draw random children with hair this distinct. He tends to give his background characters more flat designs so that they don't pop and take your attention, you know, they're meant to blend in with the background. But in the terms of the timeline, Gecko Moria would have been 12 years old during the God Valley incident, and while I do think that for Oda's style this kid looks a little bit younger than that, he could still pass for 12. More big questions though if this is indeed a Moria. Where are the horns and where is the long neck? To address that second part, fun fact about the thicker neck of Gecko Moria. Moria is often assumed by the fan base, and even at times myself, to have been a member of the Snake Neck tribe. However, this has never been confirmed and is very unlikely to be true at this point, given that Moria didn't even have a long neck until after he lost to Kaido. He had a perfectly normal neck throughout his childhood and his early adulthood, whereas the Snake Neck tribe members we do know of, like Charlotte Wero, pop straight out of the birth canal with their long necks from the get-go. And given the stitches on Moria's neck, it's weirdly not out of the question to think that he may have modified his own body to create this form for who knows what reason, or that he had Hogback's help to create that body. Gecko Moria may have chosen that body. And as for the horns, they grew in over time. The confirmed image we do have of Moria as a child has the horns only just starting to show, so I could see this God Valley kid being a younger Moria, because why not? And so the flow of this theory becomes Moria narrowly escapes the God Valley incident, but with his home island now erased from history, Moria gets taken to his ancestral home of Wano, because there's nowhere else to go, where he is allegedly raised on Ringo, and Ringo happens to be the territory where Moria fought against Kaido. So the dude could have been fighting for the place it is where he grew up, resulting in this fine meme of the Chad Kozuki warrior versus the virgin Kozuki Loden, who at the time was dancing naked in the streets of the flower capital, whilst Gecko Moria was bravely feeding the lives of his crew into the meat grinder that is Kaido. And so there's some very bitter tragedy to be had here, but also a lot of potential respect for Moria. If he was a Kozuki, then he may have been in line to become shogun, and he was acting like it by taking on Kaido to liberate his home, but it cost him everything, even his identity in the process. Meanwhile, Odin was patient. He was able to keep his vassals alive as well as the hostages that Orochi was threatening him with, and it would take a further 20 years after his death, but Odin ensured that Wano would one day be free. But that doesn't mean that Moria also won't have a big part to play in the future, because as a potential Kozuki clan member, the question does now need to be asked, can Gecko Moria read and or write poneglyphs? When I originally proposed the idea of Moria potentially being able to do this in a video, I got a lot of comments saying that it is simply not possible because the Kozuki clan only passed that ability down to one son per generation. And because Kozuki Odin was the chosen child of Moria's generation, then it means that Moria would have missed out. And this was one of those moments where I had to deeply question my fictional pirate profession, because I had no memory of this. And I scoured the manga for every Odin quote I could find, and the closest that I got was in chapter 966, where he tells Roger, "This is the secret cipher of the Kozuki clan of Wano, passed down strictly from generation to generation." Which, well, that's quite vague. It doesn't state that it can only be one son, just one generation to another generation. And due to the Kozuki family succession issues, it just turns out that it happens to be from one father to one son, because no one bothers to have more than one child. But the reason why I couldn't find this one son line is because it doesn't actually exist in the manga. It is, however, in the Wano anime, in the episode that adapted chapter 966, which wildly enough was also episode 966. That's crazy. And it is here that Odin tells Roger that only one son per generation is taught to read and write the ancient language. I don't know why it is that the anime differs so radically from the manga, but whenever the anime goes way out on a limb like that, you need to be wary of it. A good example is when the anime revealed that Diaz Drake was the man who had a 1% chance of surviving the night during the raid on Onigashima, which wasn't actually revealed at that point in the manga, and as it turns out, Hawkins was actually talking about himself. He was the 1%. So just because the anime makes a choice and says that something's true doesn't make it true. The manga is much more vague, and it leaves a lot of room for Oda to bestow abilities upon Moria if he so desires. But I'd also argue that it wouldn't matter at all if that exact line was said in the manga, because the point is that Moria has now been given that sweet, sweet proximity. Even if he wasn't formally taught, even if he wasn't allowed to be taught, there's nothing to stop Oda from saying that Moria learned himself by being sneaky and eavesdropping on Odin's secret lessons, perhaps with the assistance of shadow powers. And from here, it's very easy to make any narrative excuse that Moria could have this ability. And there's also good reason as to why he might need it, as it is heavily suspected that Moria is going to join the Cross-Guild Alliance in the future, because they do seem to be collecting former warlords. And in the Vivre Card data book, we saw one of Oda's early Cross-Guild sketches, which included Perona as a member, something that has not yet come to fruition. Perona is currently with Moria after having just escaped Hachinosu. So if Oda does still want to have Perona join Cross-Guild as was originally intended, then it would more than likely happen with Moria, because Moria has very few other options. He was imprisoned by Blackbeard, he's an enemy of Luffy, he probably isn't going to get along very well with Shanks, and he does have this slight vendetta against the world government for that incident where they tried to murder him. So Cross-Guild at the moment feels like the only fit for Moria, and he could bring great value to them in regards to the Poneglyphs. Buggy has just declared his campaign to become the Pirate King, which has forced the hands of Crocodile and Mihawk to just go along with it, and in order to have any chance of doing it, Cross-Guild will need their own Poneglyph translator to discover the location of Laugh Tale, unless Buggy just so happens to remember where it was while he was on Roger's ship. But if not, this could be a role that Oda is setting Moria up to slot perfectly into. However, we should also acknowledge that everything it is that I've just said could be an overreaction, and that what's happening here is more comedy than anything. That Moria went to Wano for his selfish reasons, as we suspected, and then people heard of this Gecko Moria clashing with Kaido. They then assumed that he was some hero trying to liberate them, and when they tried to honor his sacrifice, they spelled his name in traditional Wano style, not knowing about his katakana spelling, which over time confused people into thinking that another Kozuki existed. I do think that that would be a very fun outcome, for Moria to accidentally become a legendary hero. However, I'm less sold on this idea because even if his name was misinterpreted in kanji rather than katakana, the grave would still read Gecko Moria rather than Kozuki. The order of those two kanji matters a lot. So there would need to be a second layer of mistakes happening here. Although you could also argue that Moria lied about his name, as when on Wano, all the Straw Hats use slightly modified names like Luffy Taro, Zorojuro, Usohachi, Sangoro, Franosuke, etc. And secret names in general are also a pretty common theme on Wano. Komurasaki is actually Hiyori, Kyoshiro is actually Denjiro, Shutenmaru is Ashura Doji, Gyukimaru is Onimaru, Toniyasu, Wishimotsuki Yasuye, etc. There's so many more examples, and it could be that Moria falls into that trend as well, and perhaps lied about his heritage of being raised in Ringo. But even then, surely someone would have been able to confirm it. There were a lot of people on Wano who knew at least its recent history, and yet Kozuki Moria is now a canonized part of said history. But you let me know in the comments. Do you think Moria has some grand secret history as a Kozuki clan member, or is this all one giant shallot-shaped joke from Joke Lord Eiichiro Oda? The story of One Piece is already over. Ever since the beginning of Chapter 1, we have been on Chapter Done. The final war has been fought, the next Pirate King has been decided, and the dawn of the world has, well, hopefully occurred. With all of what's happening right now, this story right here being told to us by a mysterious entity. The most important character who we've never met, but one who we've been following ever since the beginning, the narrator of One Piece. The narrator is a very curious entity in this story because they don't function as what you'd you'd expect of a stock standard literary narrator. The characterization of the narrator has evolved over time into an existence implied to be embedded into this world, and their voice is speculated to belong to a handful of fantastic storytelling candidates that explains the nature, the intention, and even the surprising instances of unreliability presented by the narrator. So we're going to examine who it is, or is it who they are? Who are they? Because you may or may not have noticed this, but the narrator has been at least 5 different people over the course of One Piece. And that's rather curious, as the narrator is a much larger and significantly more iconic figure than most people give them credit for. As an example, it is the narrator who says the most iconic 3 words in this entire series: wealth, fame, power. And then goes on to tell us about the Pirate King's execution and the birth of the Great Age of Piracy. And whilst the narrator makes fairly sparse appearances outside of flashbacks, whenever these ever so special text boxes pop up, they tend to contain series-changing information. Grove 12, Sabadi Archipelago, the Grand Line. That day, the Straw Hat Pirates led by Monkey D. Luffy were eradicated. That is one of the heaviest lines in all of the One Piece. But another great example would be Kaido's introduction. People say in a one-on-one fight, always bet on Kaido. Land, sea, and air. Out of every living thing in this world, this pirate is said to be the strongest creature alive. So many of the most memorable quotes in this series come to us from the narrator, and these words tend to shape our perception of the One Piece world, arguably more powerful than most of its inhabitants. However, the most curious use of the narrator is when they, rather rudely I should say, rock up to give us spoilers, such as at the end of Wano. The birth of the man who would later be known around the world as the Great Shogun Kozuki-Momonosuke, or perhaps the future of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. 7 odd and mighty warriors labeled themselves as the followers of Straw Hat Luffy. After this moment, they will each grow in power until they eventually cause a great incident of historic proportions. But for the moment, that is a story no one knows about yet. And at the end of Drum Island, the narrator also teased the great symbol that Dr. Hirolook's cherry blossoms would evolve into, a symbol of freedom, and then stated that the birth of this new country, well, that's a story for another time. But one of my favorite sections of the narrator hinting at the future would definitely be the Egghead incident. Into that situation sailed the ship of Straw Hat Luffy, Emperor of the Sea. The arrival of this unexpected variable unsettled the government, to say the least, but regardless, the resolution of this incident the following day would inflict a kind of shock the world never saw coming. Which I still cling on to because yes, we've seen the incident that the narrator was referring to, but we still have yet to see the shock that it inflicted on the world, at least not at the time of this recording. But events like these give a strong impression that the narrator is a character chronicling history as events are referred to in the past tense, rather than a more abstract meta-narrator assisting readers and watchers in the moment. Which is what has really charged the question of discovering which in-world character this narrator is, and there's a lot of fantastic options, some of which make a rather tragic amount of sense, but a very important question that we need to answer first would be, is the narrator omniscient? Many would argue yes. And the primary evidence offered would be the idea that the narrator often possesses impossible knowledge, such as in Kuma's flashback when the narrator describes the God Valley incident as a, quote, event that would be lost to the dark shadows of history. And if that were true, then you would think that an in-world narrator should not be able to report and or present it. But I think this example is quite easy to explain though. Saying that the event was lost to the dark shadows of history and all, yes, that is true, but that doesn't mean that the event was never miraculously found again, which it now has been, as we actually have a first-hand account of the God Valley incident due to Jewelry Bonnie experiencing it through Kuma's memories. But we also have several God Valley alumni who are still alive, like Garp, Rayleigh, and Scopper Gaban. So saying it was lost to the dark shadows of history frankly isn't true regardless of who or what the narrator is, and I believe it's more intended to be florid language to describe the efforts of the world government to erase it. However, I think a much stronger example of potentially impossible information is with the Rocks flashback, where the narrator states, at the Reverie one year, in a historical anomaly never repeated before or since, someone infiltrated the Chamber of Flowers at the very core of the Holy Land. The man described himself as a worshipper of Davy Jones. And a few panels later, the narrator admits that, naturally, word of this incident never saw the light of day. Again, using that florid language involving the lights and the darks. In this example, yes, it's much trickier because the location, this is the most secure place base on the planet. How are we going to get a source from in there? Because neither Rox nor Emu is going to tell of this incident for their own reasons. One's dead and one's just a prick. However, there was a third person in the room at the time, and that was Gunko. And at the time of this recording, we're still waiting on Oda to expand on Gunko's connection with Brooke, but it is reasonable to speculate that she may be able to tell someone not just how this event played out with Rox, but a whole ton of previously lost history of the world through Gunko's time directly serving Emu. So we have to wait and see how that plays out, but the general idea is that many of these examples of impossible knowledge do have very viable in-world sources that could feasibly be delivered to an in-world narrator once all of this is settled. And furthermore, the narrator isn't always reliable, which does go against the omniscient presence idea. We've been lied to a handful of times. You know what? The first one, it's pretty huge. It's actually the very first thing the narrator tells us. In the series opening, the narrator states that Roger's name is Gold Roger, which is a pretty blatant piece of misinformation right there. Although realistically, the meta reason for this is because when Oda began One Piece, he didn't originally create Roger as a D character and decided to add that in later. So I'm definitely willing to let that one go, but we do have a more recent example of narrative deception. During the raid on Onigashima, after Luffy was knocked out by Kaido for I think the 5 millionth time, the narrator reported, "Battle on the roof of the Skull Dome, winner, Kaido, king of the beasts." But this was swiftly revised. Above Wano, the battle on the roof of the Skull Dome, Onigashima, winner, formerly Kaido. And then the narrator revises the results to announce Luffy as the real winner. I don't know if I would go so far as to call this a lie, but it is very interesting use of the narrator, showing that at times they are unreliable. And it's almost as if in this moment the narrator is writing history in real time. And initially the narrator, he saw the events and wrote down that Kaido won because that's what it looks like, but oh, what's this? Luffy's awakening his devil fruit. And now you've got the narrator frantically crossing out his notes and scribbling all about Luffy's victory instead. But something that often isn't addressed is the idea that the narrator has been multiple voices throughout the series, and in-world characters have periodically taken on this role, such as Kozuki Oden becoming the narrator of his flashback through his journal. Although the first time this happened was actually way back in chapter 41, where both Kaya and Mary briefly take over the narrator role, although to be honest, I think this is more because Oda was still figuring out his formatting, and he somewhat clunkily put Mary and Kaya's dialogue in the narrator boxes. At least that's what I used to think until I was confronted with another thing. In chapter 322, something very strange happens, which is that Nami takes over as the narrator, explaining what happened after the encounter with Aokiji on Long Ring Longland. And in the anime, this scene is portrayed as Nami writing in her journal to explain why it's her voice that takes over, which does establish that in-world characters can be the narrator, so why can't the narrator be an in-world character? And sometimes this narrator even quotes other in-world characters, like a historian may refer to real-life figures. The former Pirate King is directly quoted by the narrator in chapter 100, and there's a fictional physicist quoted in chapter 218 who said, "Anything man can imagine is a possibility in reality," which is something that Luffy has since gone on to prove very true. And rather recently, Louis Arnaud, the fictional author of many fictional books, was quoted during Elbaf, where he wrote a warning for travelers to not overstay their welcome there. Whatever the case, again, we've established the fact that an in-world character can take the role of the narrator. So it is very possible that the narrator themselves is an in-world presence. However, I do recognize that this was not always the case. The narrator played a very different part in the early days of One Piece, and chapters would sometimes end with the narrator saying something like, "And so the two young adventurers sail forwards to the naval base and destiny," which is what appeared at the end of chapter 2. We also have the end of chapter 7, where the narrator said, "Luffy and his first crewman set sail, neither of them realizing they've made one serious mistake." Bit of a funky cliffhanger there, which is also repeated after Orange Town in chapter 21. "And so Nami the thief joins Luffy's crew, and the two ships set out to sea together. Little do they know they'll have to face the trial of the forest." So very, very early on, the narrator was used to generate this sort of cliffhanger effect, although sometimes it was just redundant. Like after the Gaimon chapter, the aforementioned trial of the forest, the narrator just says that Luffy and friends now resume their journey. There's not really any point to having him there, which is why Oda eventually stopped using the narrator for this purpose. These interjections happen mostly during East Blue, and during this time, I do believe it was intended to be a standard literary narrator, or perhaps even the voice of Eiichiro Oda himself. And with that, one of the weirdest, like properly weird examples of narration we have actually happens in chapter 1. And this is where the narrator describes how Luffy is feeling. Luffy understood why Shanks wouldn't take him out to sea. The dangers of the sea were too great, and he was not yet strong enough. But most of all, Luffy realized what a great man Shanks was. He vowed to be just like him one day. This is something that Oda would never do again following the first chapter. And this is due to his philosophy on Luffy being that there is no need for thought bubbles or narration in regards to him, because Luffy in theory will just say everything it is that he's feeling. However, in this first outing of One Piece, Oda didn't have the mastery necessary to express these feelings naturally through Luffy himself, and so he resorted to narration in order to explain it. So in the beginning, I do think the narrator was the voice of Oda, just because he thought it necessary for the good of the story to inject himself from time to time and to say what it is that he was trying to do. However, the narrator has since evolved into an entity that feels infinitely more grounded within the world itself, and I think there is a good argument to be made that several characters are now responsible for this role. Because sure, let's say that in the beginning I accept that it was Oda, it was the author who was the narrator, that is fine. That just means we add one more person to our list of narrators, it's now 6 instead of 5. So with that, I ask, who is the narrator of One Piece? Well, the quickest, easiest, and most objectively correct answer to that question may surprise you, because it is Smoker. In the anime, Smoker is voiced by Mahito Oba, who also voices the narrator. In fact, the narrator obviously came first, and has had more lines overall in One Piece than Smoker has, so he should really be more known as the narrator. But in addition to that, Oba also voices the Panda Man, who hasn't had a speaking role in the anime or the manga yet, but he has been extremely vocal in many One Piece games. And in case you're curious, here is what the Panda Man sounds like. Obviously, it's probably not going to turn out to be Smoker. That'd be wild. But it did need mentioning. However, a more popular and less memey answer would be that the narrator is Sabo, because in chapter 585, he revealed his dream to see the world and write a book about it. And given that he is Luffy's brother, it could retrospectively make stuff like that chapter 1 narration make sense. Luffy's direct feelings would be something that Sabo has a first-hand account of, because there is no doubt in my mind that Luffy, when he was a child, would never shut up about Shanks and how great of a pirateman he was and why he couldn't join his crew yet. However, another natural suspect is Usopp, with the idea that he is telling the story of One Piece to a group of kids or something. And what I will say for this suspect is that a lot of the most epic of narrator lines do sound like the kind of crazy exaggerations that Usopp would concoct. Usopp loves to use numbers, big throbbing numbers, and so does the narrator. I mean, just listen to this and pretend that it's Usopp speaking. Even in death, even with half his face gone, he would never fall. He will forever be remembered as a monster for the way he destroyed his enemies that day. In this battle alone, he suffered 267 sword wounds, was struck by 152 bullets, and 46 cannon blasts. And yet neither that mighty body nor his pirate's pride suffered even one coward's wound. It sounds like a slightly more refined Usopp, and this might also explain the dramatic flourishes, like announcing that Kaido won and then revising it to Luffy, as if we've got someone who is retelling this story to extract maximum tension, with the potentially hilarious twist that after Usopp's finished telling the story, the kids will accuse him of lying. The one time that he's actively telling the truth after he's seen and done so much that lies can't compete with reality anymore is the one time that no one believes him. But there's also a strong argument to be made for another Straw Hat as well, and that is Nico Robin. I actually feel like she's a more suitable candidate than either Sabo or Usopp or Smoker or Panda Man, and Robin would explain why the narrator pops up periodically to describe culture and is generally focused on fact-based history. I've gone over a lot of the more epic narrator moments, but sometimes the narrator rocks up to provide more subtle insight as well. Such as when Luffy lands on Amazon Lily, the narrator goes into some pretty unusual detail about how the society functions and focuses a fair bit on the unique geography of the island, also lingering on a handful of interesting anthropological aspects. And another great instance would be when the crew first arrive on Dressrosa. The narrator takes this opportunity to briefly commandeer of the story to explain the beauty of the island's flowers, the enchanting smell of its cooking, as well as the, quote, tireless gyrations of the ladies' passionate dances. So Sanji may have gotten in to write that part, but this focus on culture is very Robin-esque. When she explores an island, she wants to understand it and is fascinated by every aspect of it. And so this would be Robin making her contribution to the world by telling its true history, but framing it in the context of what life was like in this incarnation of the world, which is why certain events are referenced as never having seen the light of day. They never saw the light of day in that world. As something rather impactful here is the knowledge that when One Piece ends, we will be living in a completely different world. I mean, we won't be, they will be, and it's they that I'm talking about. As according to the Harley text, this world that we're reading about right now, it's ending. And that adds a lot more to think about when the narrator says stuff like this event was lost to history. Because sure, maybe it was lost, but lost to the history of that world. Not this one, that one. Although something that does go against this idea of Robin being the narrator is the fact that the narrator existed long before she did. Robin is famously the only Straw Hat crew member who was not originally planned from the get-go, and her slot was originally going to be filled by this floaty net holding guy. But again, that doesn't matter too much because the narrator was a completely different entity in the beginning of One Piece with a different purpose, as we've already explored. Meanwhile, a much sadder proposition for the narrator would be Brooke, with the bittersweet notion of him keeping the story, the legend, or perhaps by this stage, even the myth of the One Piece story alive, as Brooke is destined to outlive all of his friends by who knows how many decades, centuries, or millennia. But One Piece could also be told by Bartolomeo, as he's keeping more track of the Straw Hats in newspapers and everything than anyone else, and he probably has the most complete library of sources tracking their journey, and you could even argue that it might be Big News Morgan's, telling this story on his mission to stir the hearts and minds of his readers. And this here is future Liam speaking, but in retrospect, I am almost certain that these opening words were written by Big News Morgan's, because when Roger reads the article about him being crowned as the Pirate King, these words are also written in that article. So we'll add Big News Morgan's to the list of in-world narrators and get back to whatever it is that I was just saying. When it comes to what I think that if the narrator is an in-world character, then it's probably not just one person, and that One Piece is more likely to be a collection of accounts of the world that have been strung together to give us the journey of the Straw Hats. And it kind of already is that. Again, we featured at least 4 in-world characters as narrators providing their unique perspectives, and this idea could even explain the inconsistencies like Old Roger, the incorrect name of the Pirate King being used in Chapter 1. Because let's say that this quote was taken from a source, a publication reporting on Roger's execution, someone that didn't actually know him. And it's just a historical account, inaccuracies and all. And as the story goes on, whenever details of specific Straw Hat journeys are needed, that could be Usopp or Nami. And when we need historical or cultural context, that could be Robin's contribution, as well as seeking out other sources wherever necessary, like Bartolomeo adding supplementary information he's gathered and stuff like that. And the story of One Piece could even be a project being contributed to by each and every person who knew Luffy or who was affected by Luffy, and this whole project is the result of him successfully bringing the planet together through the dawn of the world. I'm not sure about that, but I do know a thing, and that thing is that the narrator was the very first voice we read or heard at the beginning of the series, and no matter who or what it is, they will almost certainly be the last voice we see or hear as well. This will blow you away. In Chapter 1096, a vacationing Monkey D. Garp is informed of the impending God Valley incident. Garp then chastises the Marines for messing with Hashinosu, specifically mentioning a stolen treasure. However, this gets lost in English translation, but the more accurate translation is not treasure, but crown jewel, with the word jewel being horseki, which is spelled with the kanji for rock. Rock being the name of the Rocksteezebek guy, and due to the way that L's and R's function in Japanese, that crown jewel could just as easily be a clown jewel. And interestingly, a certain Buggy the Clown just so happened to be born in the exact same year of the God Valley incident. Around the same time that clown jewel was stolen by the Marines, and after the defeat of Rocks, Buggy ended up on the vessel of Goldie Roger alongside Baby Shanks, masterfully hinting that Buggy the Clown is the child of Rocksteezebek and that crown jewel is actually a clown rock. words. Or not. I just thought that would be a fun way to start the video. Absolutely everything I just said there, ridiculous. Everything with the exception of one very real possibility. That Buggy could be the son of Roxy-Gecko. Let me give you the real evidence. It's not because of the ridiculous language reasoning that One Piece theorists tend to lean far too much into and often take advantage of your probably lack of Japanese knowledge, but it's because of three very real fictional things that have happened in One Piece that directly connect Buggy to Roxy-Gecko. The first of which is an uncomfortably close correlation of ambition. I often bring up Buggy's foreshadowing where he's stating that he'll become one of the 4 emperors, which he did, and then the Pirate King, which he may very well do. However, I often neglect that during Marineford, Buggy made a third and even bigger declaration. When the gates of justice miraculously open as Buggy raises his arms, he thinks to himself, "Is it the will of heaven that I become king?" Which at first I thought could be referring to Buggy's previous Pirate King thought. However, when Whitebeard asks Buggy for an alliance, this is where the true thought becomes clear, because he says, "I actually think I can do it now. I can do it. I can see it now. I'm gonna be king of the world," which at the time we just wrote off as some, classic Buggy comedy. However, in chapter 975, Sengoku informed us about the desires of Roxy-Gecko. The ambition of their Captain Rox was to be king of the world. However it came about and however differently they plan on implementing it, Buggy has the same ambition as Rox. Which does sound a bit generic, but it's actually not in One Piece. People don't tend to say king of the world, because most are really gunning for Pirate King. And I have to say, Buggy's doing a mighty fine job of enacting this desire as well. Buggy is currently causing more chaos for the world government than any emperor due to Cross Guild's competitive marine bounty system. For the first time that we know of, there's a monetary incentive to kill or capture marines. So that is essentially declaring war on the world government. I dare say a very Roxian maneuver. And Buggy has also had this obsession with obtaining Captain John's treasure. Captain John being a former member of the Rocks Pirates whose corpse we met on Thriller Bark, which is a cool little side plot that gets weaved into pre-time skip One Piece. In chapter 522, Elder Nyan is reading a newspaper, and if you zoom in, you can see a photo of Buggy, because what this article is reporting is his arrest while searching for the treasure of Captain John, which he did assumedly find later when Luffy gave Buggy Captain John's treasure marker, which was the armband that he acquired on Thriller Bark. And Elder Nyan, of course, being Gloriosa, who was also a member of the Rocks Pirates, so look, mate, this Buggy can't seem to get away from these naturally occurring solid mass or aggregate of minerals that are the Rocks Pirates. And something that I love is that Buggy's crew were almost like a parody of the Rocks Pirates, with Alvida being kind of the reverse Big Mom. She started out large and then slimmed down, and both of them go through their cowboy hat phases. And really, Alvida is what happens if Big Mom and Kaido had a child together, because she also uses that big old club. But Buggy's 100 Beast Kaido is actually Moji the Beast Tamer, and you even have his lion Richie standing in for Golden Lion Shiki. And as for Kabaji, well, he doesn't really fit in, so I'm just going to employ my usual life strategy of ignoring him. Mr. 3 also doesn't fit, but that doesn't matter because all of this is a joke. However, this joke has slowly been turning into a reality, because we also have the Impel Down prisoners, and none of these pirates have ever been named, but they were strong enough for even Whitebeard to recognize that they would be a massive problem to deal with, very much reflecting the original residents of Hachinosu, known as the most vicious and powersome of pirates who all fought for the right to join Rox's crew. And really, the founding of Cross Guild is the closest thing we have to a New Age Rocks Pirates, combining all of these legendary figures who are typically either solo agents or heads of their own organization, and bringing them all under the decadent circus tent of Buggy. Cross Guild even have a very disgruntled Rocks Pirate-esque dynamic. The trio of Buggy, Mihawk, and Crocodile all kind of despise each other and despise the fact that they've been brought together by fate. But we should also examine Buggy's mysterious origins, because this is a big one. At this point in the series, Buggy is a genuinely more mysterious character than Shanks. We now know more about Shanks' origins than we do Buggy's. So Buggy and Shanks are both 39 years old, meaning that both of them were born just before the God Valley incident 38 years ago. For the record, Shanks is slightly older, having been born on the 9th of March, and Buggy was born on the 8th of August. And both of these dates are numerical puns for the respective characters, as Shanks' birthday is the closest you can get to pronouncing his name, with the numbers being Sun Q, and Buggy's birthday can be said as Barabara, which is of course the name of his devil fruit. Also, an even bigger side note here, Oda didn't even choose Shanks' birthday. It was picked for him by a reader who suggested it, and that same reader also decided Boa Hancock's birthday. But other than birthdays, we know pretty much nothing about Buggy. We don't even know his full name, if in fact Buggy is his real name. The only other thing we know is that according to the One Piece Vivre Card databook, Buggy was born in the Grand Line. We don't know when he joined Roger's crew, although for whatever reason the One Piece wiki says that Buggy joined when he was 9 years old, but this is inaccurate. 9 years old is just the earliest point in time that we've seen Buggy with the Roger Pirates. But both Shanks and Buggy being the same age is very important, because it means that the Roger Pirates could very well have sailed away from God Valley with 2 babies instead of just one, being baby Shanks, who they found in a plundered treasure chest. Speaking of, it's heavily implied that Shanks is a member of the Figerland family, the current patriarch of which is Figerland Garling. That's going to be relevant in a second, but for now, the idea goes as follows. On God Valley, notorious bad man Rox-Diesebek was beaten and the Rox Pirates were fractured and disbanded. However, during his time on this planet, Rox managed to make a deposit of man ore into the mine of a willing participant, who may or may not have been a literal clown woman, which ended up producing Buggy. And after the Rox Pirates disbanded, there was no one left to take care of this Buggy. So he ended up on Roger's ship, although exactly how can be a bit difficult to explain. A simple way of explaining it would be that even at an age before speech was possible, Buggy was enamored by the idea of treasure and found his way into the same pile of treasure chests that baby Shanks did. And really, they could have been having their very own episode of Rugrats whilst the God Valley incident was in full swing. Another idea I've seen proposed is that Buggy was purposely left on God Valley and rescued by the Marines, very specifically Garp. And we all know Garp's feelings about the sins of the father and all that, but knowing that the world government wouldn't take too kindly to Buggy should they discover that he's the son of the man who almost destroyed their entire system, Garp handed Buggy to his old rival Roger, a maneuver that would later come full circle when Roger delivered his own child to Garp to do the same in his absence, thus continuing the string of child leapfrogging. Rox died, so Roger raised his child, then Roger died, so Garp raised his child, which would also tell us why Roger was ever so confident that Garp would raise Ace, because Garp owed Roger a big parental favor, although most of Garp's responsibility was dumped onto miscellaneous bandits and the megafauna of the Goa Kingdom. It is a bit admittedly convoluted, but so is any Buggy origin story, no matter how mundane it may be. Somehow Roger had to be okay with a child boarding his ship from the age of 0 to 9, which, Shanks aside because that was an accident that they ended up with, Roger is not generally okay with. He doesn't just pick up any old kid keen on a bit of yar and me hearties, which we saw on Zoe, when an absolutely adorable little Pedro begged to join Roger's crew, but Roger declined and said that everyone gets their time to shine, which would go on to happen, just unfortunately when Pedro was at the center of a very shiny explosion. The bigger point is that you can't just take random kids. Roger needed a reason, ideally a good reason, to let Buggy become a permanent member of his crew. And the potential of a Will of D lineage is a pretty damn good one. And it also sets up the potentially fun dynamic of Buggy and Shanks. You have the child of a world noble and a child of the greatest threat to the world nobles being raised together on the same vessel. It is a recipe for forbidden comedy. And Buggy and Shanks always fighting is that poetic continuation of the idea that the Will of D are the enemies of the gods, and there can be no peace between the child of a world noble and the child of a D clan member. And even though he's never stated to be a D, like Luffy and like Blackbeard, Buggy is a clear subject of fate. And fate, I have to say, is doing a lot of heavy lifting with Buggy. Luffy and Blackbeard are at least able to pull their own weight from time to time, and Buggy actually shares a pretty ridiculous amount of similarities to Luffy, having both followed the path from nobodies at Orangetown to full-blown emperorhood at roughly the same pace. However, something that very much gets overlooked about Buggy is that he has Luffy's most dangerous ability as identified by Draco Mihawk. It's not his powers or techniques. He possesses some quality that makes people want to help him, and in these waters, that is the most formidable power of all. That's what Mihawk said about Luffy. Everywhere Luffy goes, he makes new allies, but everywhere Buggy goes, he makes new allies as well. On the island with Gaimon, at sea with Alvida, and even the prisoners of Impel Down. And Buggy's ability is so formidable that these days even Mihawk himself has reluctantly succumbed to this, which if anything is a big one-up on Luffy. Ah, Straw Hat, I see you've recruited a man who wants to become the world's greatest swordsman. Well, I, Clown, have skipped that step and just recruited the world's greatest swordsman. If you look at Buggy's crew, he's even gathered his members one at a time over a lot of time, just like Luffy. And then there's this line about Rox-Diesebek. He was Roger's first foe, and perhaps his greatest. And all jokes aside, that very much applies to Luffy and Buggy. Yeah, Luffy fought Alvida and Morgan before Buggy, but Buggy was the first villain to come back into Luffy's life and truly earned that title of foe. In fact, Buggy has almost killed Luffy on 2 occasions now. One when he was trapped in the cage at Orangetown, and then Buggy got even closer on the execution platform of Logtown. Not many other villains can claim that, so Buggy certainly is a great destined foe. And whilst you know the word greatest may not necessarily apply here, that's not how history is going to remember Buggy. Now that he's an emperor, you can be sure that all sorts of stories are spreading about Luffy and Buggy's legendary battle at Orangetown, a conflict that threatened to destroy not just the town, but the entirety of the East Blue. And Buggy's potential lineage also makes the current makeup of the four emperors very interesting. You've got Shanks, the man who was raised by Roger. Then next to him there's Luffy, the man who inherited Roger's will. Alongside that we have Buggy, the son of Roxy-Zebek. And rounding things out with a very big tummy, we have Blackbeard, the man who inherited the will of Roxy-Zebek. Either way, the path to the top of this world is rife with nepotism. In Buggy's case, we'd just be adding another layer. Nepotism being another one of those features that Luffy just excels at. What, being born from the world's most wanted man, having a grandfather who's the most legendary marine to have ever lived, along with the inherited will of the Pirate King, and even having been directly mentored by Shanks. Buggy needs to catch up. Currently, all he has to his pedigree is being the quote blood brother of Shanks and being raised by the Pirate King. Adding in being the biological son of Rox is exactly what Buggy needs to take that final step and make everyone both love and fear him that much more. So up until now, I've been considering that Buggy's existence as kind of like the comical parody of Rox, but we've just been assuming that Rox was this all-powerful Giga Chad, capable of corralling your Whitebeards and your big mothers, but we don't know that. As disappointing as it may sound at this stage, there is nothing to say that Rox wasn't the Buggy of his generation. A comic relief character who stumbled his way into almost ruling the world, and of course carried by a legion of powerful people behind him. I mean, just think about when the Cross-Guild legend is going to be told 50 years from now, people aren't going to have any context about who Buggy actually was. All they're going to know is that he's the man who united Sir Crocodile, Dracula Mihawk, and thousands of other pirates under his Jolly Roger. Whether they're related or not, Buggy is going to be remembered in the same vein as Rox. In fact, even more so, because he'll actually be remembered by history instead of being erased. Roxy-Zebek was Goldie Roger's first rival, and Buggy was Luffy's first rival. And together they went on to gain power and infamy, and are ultimately destined to clash to decide the fate of the world. To be clear, this is just an idea, a probably stupid idea, but everything about Buggy was at some stage a stupid idea. If you went back to the days of Marineford and genuinely argued that Buggy would become an emperor, then you'd be laughed straight out of Clowntown. But he proved us all wrong. He went and did it. There's just something about Buggy that means you can never underestimate or dismiss an idea surrounding him, no matter how absurd. And being the son of Rox is far from the worst Buggy theory I've heard. Oh, and also, just as one more little bonus hint from the author himself, in chapter 1082, when Buggy is speaking to his forces, if you zoom in on the man with the axe, there is a tattoo on his arm which says Rox, potentially hinting at Buggy's secret lineage. But it would also mean that this particular crew member, for whatever reason, asked his tattoo artist to draw the word upside down, assumedly so that we, the viewers, could gaze upon it gloriously at this very moment. So that's quite some future sight that man with axe had. But you let me know in the comments, what do you think of Buggy being the son of Rox? And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed. Blackbeard isn't evil, he just does things antagonistic from our main characters. He could be the hero this world needs, just like his father. Oh, how I wish this was true. I would definitely love to see a bit more nuance and a bit more gray area with Mr. Blackbeard, but I do think it's pretty hard to make the case for Teach not being evil at this point, or at the very least, being some kind of misunderstood good guy. Just because he did murder Thatch, he killed Whitebeard, he owned slaves, there's a lot of other bad things. And those bad things that we've seen, there's a lot we actually know about Blackbeard that makes him harder to redeem. As opposed to, say, Rox, who up until now we never saw. We just heard was a very bad dude. Heard from unreliable sources like Sengoku. Kind of like Loki, actually. We've just been told that this Loki is a bad guy, but we haven't really seen anything from him. And given how Rox turned out, I 100% expect Loki to be a misunderstood hero as well. Blackbeard though, mate, that is, it's a rough ask. At the moment, I see Blackbeard as yet another example of a demon that the world government have created for themselves. In their demonization of Roxy-Zebek, they ended up actually creating what they portrayed Rox as, a monster from the Davy clan that has manifested to bring their worst nightmares to fruition. Although there's a very important step that we're missing here, which is who Blackbeard's mentor figure is going to be. Because there are a lot of One Piece characters who have gone past this exact intersection of tragedy. Nico Robin very easily could have become the demon that the world government claimed she was, and we do actually see this happen in Oda's dark timeline drawings of her. But Robin had the fortune of meeting Jaguar D. Sol, who shaped her life in a positive way. Meanwhile, to look at an example on the other side, Charlotte Lin Lin, she could have become a force of good, but she had her life negatively shaped by Streusen. So we're still missing a very important piece of the Blackbeard puzzle here. Because at this point in time, 38 years ago, Marshall D. Teach has the potential to go on to become a Luffy or a Roger, but something unknown at this stage pushes him down the opposite direction. Eris cooked up delicious cherry pies for Teach when he was little. That is exactly what the answer is, isn't it? If Blackbeard's love of cherry pies is because his mother used to make them for him, then it would be tragically adorable. And that is the sort of thing that just may open up a crack of redemption. Not that I think that Blackbeard can ever be fully redeemed at this stage, but it might result in Blackbeard taking some sort of important action that ensures the dawn of the world because he still possesses that lingering love for his mother. Blackbeard using Saturn's body to help take over the world government is obviously going to be satisfying given that Saturn, through Emu, is likely responsible for Rox's death. So this is referring to chapter 1107 when Katarina Devon touched Saint Saturn in his spider form, and given that she has a mythical devil fruit that allows her to take on the appearance of those she has touched, it does seem as though the Blackbeard pirates are going to use Saturn's form in the future, or potentially even as we speak. You may have forgotten this because I think it happened back in June? But Marijois is currently on fire and under attack. We don't know by who, but the Blackbeard pirates are one of the main candidates. Although I should emphasize that it was never Blackbeard's plan to gain access to Saturn's form. That was more or less lucky, or dare I say even a fated event, because it is interesting that Emu appears to have used Saturn's body to kill Blackbeard's father, and now Blackbeard is going to use Saturn's body for some nasty acts against Emu probably. This is temporal poetry. We've got to rhyme through time. A year ago, the idea of Luffy and Blackbeard as reluctant allies was absurd given the death of Ace. Now I have to wonder what Oda is planning with the most recent reveals. The two of them have always already kind of been unwilling allies. Neither one of them, not a Luffy, not a Blackbeard, would be where they are today without the actions of the other, which is especially cruel for Luffy, but it is true. And I fully expect that dynamic to continue all the way through to the dawn of the world, because you cannot have a dawn without there first being a tremendous darkness. I just wanted to share a feeling I've had since the Five Elders. Everybody that uses the Emu regeneration doesn't scare me as antagonists. They are great characters, but I do not feel that overwhelming sense of dread because they seem so weak in comparison. So I'm not a doctor, but I'm going to diagnose you with the symptoms of the regeneration problem, which has been an issue in shonen manga for a long time, particularly with Dragon Ball. But the issue is that in order to showcase a regeneration ability, you need to have characters being severely wounded. For example, in chapter 1162, we see Figurland Garling with, mate, look at this. His head is split open and it is slowly regenerating back to normal. And it looks very cool. It's such a wonderful showcase of a regeneration ability. It's very almost body horror-esque. However, if this had happened to any other One Piece character, then they would probably be dead. And regeneration only really looks cool when you use it for these kind of fatal injuries. But what it does, right, is it artificially creates the illusion that characters with regeneration are weaker and or more incompetent than those who do not have those powers, because the regeneration characters receive these fatal injuries on a scarily regular basis. And you never see people like Roger or Rayleigh getting their brain split open because they can't recover from that. And so it artificially elevates them to looking more powerful and more competent as a result. I will say this effect does have some in-world logic to it though, because if I had these sort of regeneration powers, then I would be a lot less careful as well, because I'd know that, if I got my head cut off, it wouldn't matter. I would know that there are not any consequences to making mistakes. And so it makes perfect sense that characters with regeneration are just less competent than characters without it. But that sort of carelessness often doesn't help to craft compelling antagonists. And if you're going to do that, you need an extra factor, like say Big Mom. She is an incredibly careless fighter, but that is because she has the mind of a child, so it works well for her character. However, for those who are portrayed as more mentally competent, like the Holy Knights and the Elder Stars, it does have the effect of making them look quite sloppy. And I do think that this regeneration ability is a curse that Oda has now placed on himself, because he has a lot of work to do to really make these guys feel intimidating again. And to bring Blackbeard back into this is why I feel so good about him as an upcoming antagonist, because even though he uses a Logia fruit, it specifically does not allow him to regenerate like other Logias. So at the very least, Blackbeard probably will not have this problem. Internet man, is it just me who is beginning to feel like this flashback is going to be the longest we have seen? It feels like ages ago that we had an appearance of Loki or Harold, and we still have a long way to go. So I've already seen a lot of people in the comments claiming that this is the longest flashback in One Piece, but we're not quite there yet. Kozuki-Oden's flashback was about 15 chapters long. It went from chapter 960 to 974. Meanwhile, this flashback is currently 10 chapters, but I will grant that it probably feels longer because back in the Oden flashback days, we didn't have quite as many breaks between chapters. But for this to become the longest flashback in One Piece, the number that we are looking for is 1168. If we hit that and we are still reading these black pages, then it will become the new Flashback King. And with the current publishing schedule, chapter 1168 would be happening in December, and it would be the second last chapter published of this year. Potentially even the last one if there's another unexpected break, and potentially delayed till 2026 if there's more than one unexpected break. Either way, at this point, I'm pretty comfortable in saying that we are more than likely spending the rest of the year in this Elbaf flashback. Because sure, God Valley's going to end soon, probably real soon, but then we need to actually cover, all of the Elbaf stuff. While I am absolutely loving this backstory, I feel like it has definitely crossed the line in its placement in the story. I would have preferred if this came at either the end or the beginning of Elbaf. Remember, we were really just starting the big fight before we got caught on this train. So I 100% get why you would have this feeling. Back in my day, I felt very similar when the Straw Hats were finally face to face with CP9 on Eni Sobby, with fantastic some fight battles about to begin, and then bam! We were hit with Robin backstory, and my 16-year-old self did the mental maths and realized that we wouldn't be getting any action for about a month, which felt like a really long time when I was that age. And I really did not appreciate flashbacks anywhere near as much as I do now. In fact, now it's pretty much completely the opposite. I tend to look forward to flashbacks much more so than the big final fights, because flashbacks are where all of the cool reveals and all of the best writing happens, in my opinion. And while they do issue a hard pause on modern events, I don't know if there's a better way to place One Piece flashbacks. Because what Oda is trying to achieve is priming the audience for a satisfying defeat of a villain. Because when you think about it, many of Luffy's iconic punches lose their weight if we do not have these tragedies fresh in our minds. Like Luffy's first punch of Arlong coming right after Nami's flashback, and the incredible satisfaction we feel because that Nami wound is still very much open. But if you leave too much time between the flashback and the final fight, then that wound, it has time to heal. Which is a problem that I actually think Oda encountered during the raid on Onigashima. We had the full Oden flashback, and so we were primed to take on the Kaido, but over the 2 years that the raid took to publish, the feeling of the Oden flashback got a bit lost, and that's why during year 2 of the raid, a lot of weekly readers started to disconnect from the relentless action. And look, not to defend the Toei anime too hard here, but the one thing that you will never be allowed to forget in the anime is the feeling of the flashbacks, because they will be referenced for filler at every possible opportunity. But that's why you can't do the flashbacks too early, because they need to be as close as possible to the final action, and you can't do them afterwards, because that would be like asking someone to be hungry after having eaten a full meal. In defense of the commenter though, look, traditionally One Piece flashbacks are nowhere near this long. 4 to 6 chapters is the standard for the bulk of the series, so suddenly jumping into a 10 to 15 chapter side story can be a bit annoying if you were really invested in what was happening on Elbaf. Because to do the maths, by the time that we get out of this flashback, it will have been about 6 months since we last saw modern day Elbaf. That is a long time. So I can definitely understand the frustration in an author asking you, no, just wait half a year and then we'll get back to what we were doing. The Vivre Card data book is getting more things wrong. This time it said that Katakuri ate his devil fruit 43 years ago, but the God Valley incident happened 38 years ago. So that is correct, or I guess I should say that is incorrect, as we have another Vivre Card plot hole and/or/retcon, as it does say that Katakuri ate his devil fruit when he was 5 years old. However, Big Mom here was trying to secure Kaido's devil fruit for Katakuri on God Valley when he was 10 years old. And this is purely an Oda fault, because he doesn't write the Vivre Cards entirely by himself, but he does give previously unknown information like this. These little facts are not just made up by some guy. I will say it's not really a big deal, and this is kind of showing the purpose of the Vivre Card databook. If you're not familiar, it is what is referred to as a living databook, meaning that character entries are constantly updated and receive new cards, so nothing is ever 100% set in stone. And another example of this would be Caesar Clown. The Vivre Card databook originally listed him as being 40 years old, but after Oda introduced Mads, Caesar had another 15 years added to his age so that he could actually be old enough to have been part of Mads, and now he is canonically 55 years old instead of 40. So the dude lost almost as many years of his life as Momonosuke did, all for the sake of continuity. And as a side note, this is probably why Oda is usually quite purposely vague in the manga itself, because if these details are printed in the manga, then they do become genuine plot holes that cannot be fixed. But because no one really takes the Vivre Card databook 100% seriously, it allows Oda to give out these details to satisfy strange men on the internet, but to put an asterisk next to those details that gives Oda the freedom to change them later. Man in the internet, are we not going to talk about Whitebeard encountering the Gods Knights and possibly Emu, then years later still pulling up to try and save Ace? Pretty crazy in hindsight. I don't know, given the showing of the Holy Knight so far, I'm not sure if they would have been a huge concern. But also, Emu can't just go ahead and show himself at Marineford because he would have been revealing himself to the world, or I guess revealing the world to its citizens. However, if things had gone differently and the Whitebeard pirates were in a spot to come out victorious, like let's say for example that Kaido and the Beast Pirates weren't stopped by Shanks, and Marineford was looking to be the defeat of the Marines at the hands of two emperors, and thus Emu or the Elder Stars or both may have had to step in at that point. But look, even if Emu did show up, what would it change? Whitebeard was never just going to let Ace be executed. So it doesn't really matter what the world government threw at him. Also, at the time, Whitebeard believed that Ace would be the man to inherit Roger's will. So I don't think that Whitebeard even saw Ace's death as a possible outcome. However, he did know that his own death would have a role to play in saving the life of his son, and therefore the son that would go on to bring about the dawn of the world. That was the theory anyway. Honestly, I'm surprised to think that Yamato's cover story is over when it hasn't been fully shown to be the case yet, as I'm usually the sort of person who waits till there is more conclusive proof. Though you can go ahead and explain why that is or is not the case if you wish. Yeah, I can explain that. Yamato's cover story is over because all cover stories end with the words final volume, which indicates that we are done and moving on. I wish that we weren't, because I feel like there's a lot more that could have been done with this cover story, and I really want to at least have a tease for what Yamato plans to do now, but it is what it is. Hey, Australian fictional pirate lover, what if for the God Valley flashback, Toei adapts it into a movie? That way it's canon, and it will actually be something people want to watch. I mean, in defense of Film Red, that was something that people, at least with all of the money speaking, wanted to watch. But my thoughts on this happening would be extremely mixed. Firstly, adapting this 10 to 15 chapters into a movie would be pretty phenomenal, and purely from a business perspective, Toei has to be looking at the success of stuff like Demon Slayer Infinity Castle, Jujutsu Kaisen 0, and the Chainsaw Man movie and thinking, hey guys, maybe making canon movies is a pretty damn good idea. However, I'd also argue that One Piece is still very much going off in its own direction. It really hasn't adapted to the modern anime scene at all. But also it doesn't necessarily need to, because again, Film Red was successful on such a level that I still don't think most of us appreciate. It made $250 million, and it's not only by far the highest grossing One Piece film of all time, but it is the 7th highest grossing Japanese film of all time, not just anime films, movies in general. But the main reason why I don't think there will ever be a God Valley film is because it would be a movie without Luffy and the Straw Hats, which for people who watch men talk about fictional pirates on the internet is not a big deal, because characters like Rox and Roger, they are just as much, if not more, of a selling point than seeing Luffy. But Film Red really made its money because it pushed out into a general audience who are not fully consumed by One Piece lore. They have more of a vague awareness of the world and its characters, and you are going to have a rough time getting them into a theater without putting Luffy on a poster. But it's also hard to see a God Valley movie being made because it removes material for the anime to adapt, and it makes their job of producing an episode every week even harder than it already is. Taking away 15 chapters for a movie is actively removing 6 months worth of material for the anime, because One Piece isn't on a seasonal model like Demon Slayer, like Jujutsu Kaisen, like The Chainsaw Man, and like every other modern anime that takes advantage of making canon films. So TLDR, I think it would be pretty awesome, but there is no way it's happening. I think Oda is testing the waters with all the emphasis on love in Elbaf, and making it one of the biggest reasons for God Valley just makes me think that the Void Century flashback will be about love too. So this is definitely what One Piece is from here on out. Not necessarily romantic love, but I think that parental love is going to be an enduring theme for the rest of the series. Oda has had much more of a focus on kids and their parents in post-time skip One Piece, which is very much the opposite of what he did in pre-time skip, with more of an emphasis on found family. And this parental child focus is only intensifying with each new arc. And I doubt that the Void Century will be much different. In fact, it'll be the most important of all, because the Void Century is where we need to establish the power of inherited will and passing that will down to the next generation. Also, I can't help but think there's probably going to be some elements of romance as well, or at least it looks like there will be with Imu and Lily, be that a one-sided romance or not. But you let me know in the comments, what do you expect to see in the Void Century flashback? In the latest One Piece episode, Walkuri says that he will prevent Luffy from entering his, quote, original form. Do you think there will be another gear form for Luffy? Mate, I was caught very off guard by this, because the anime added quite an impactful line that was not in the manga. And it was when Walkuri said Monkey D. Luffy, which is already weird, because the elders don't tend to address humans by their actual names, not to their faces anyway, they call them insects and such. But Saint Big Pig goes on to say, to make sure you will not turn back to your original form, I will chop you up. So in the manga, Walkuri doesn't say anything at this point. He just attacks and Dorian Broggy block on behalf of Luffy. But in the anime, Walkuri does seem to be implying that Gear 5th Luffy is not his final form, and that there is a further, or I guess backwards, original state that he must prevent Luffy from reaching. And it may even be implying that Luffy himself is actually Nika, not just a dude cosplaying Nika with the help of magical fruit. And I really don't know what to make of this. Anime original lines are always to be taken with a healthy dose of delicious skepticism, because sometimes their decisions do directly contradict the manga. However, whether it is right or not that, I think that we all know deep down there will be another transformation, or at least a Gear 5th variant, because that is just the way of shonen manga, and as broken as Gear 5th is now, I cannot wait to see how Oda tops it. Something I haven't seen mentioned anywhere regarding the unfolding God Valley incident is how formative it may be for Kaido, who will see the tragic yet proud death of his captain, which will form his philosophy on how death completes a man. Right, first thing, I think you haven't seen it mentioned because people have more or less given up on Kaido's backstory. I recently made a video focusing on the Kaido in question, and something that I very foolishly left out was the reaction of Kaido's voice actor Tessho Genda when he was finally defeated on Wano. After he recorded what he didn't realize at the time was his final episode, at least for Wano, he was dumbstruck and he asked the director, "Did I just lose?" And Mayumi Tanaka, the voice of Luffy, had a similar reaction. Both of them were very surprised that Kaido was beaten when he was, because they both felt like there was still more story to be told there, or at least more battle to be had. And so there is an opportunity to tell more story with Rocks. The suggestion here being that Rocks will provide Kaido with a model of how to die, which will begin his death obsession. However, it could also go in very much the other direction. Rocks could die in a way that Kaido deems insufficient of a man of his prominence, which is why when he's introduced after Dressrosa, Kaido only mentions Whitebeard and Roger as people who have died correctly. He also might only mention those two because Rocks may not have existed in Oda's mind when Kaido was introduced at the end of Dressrosa, but I am hoping that however God Valley ends, it will provide the formative context I crave so dearly for Mr. Kaido, as it was something definitely bad enough to make Kaido abandon the remaining Rocks pirates and to leave without telling Lin anything. Something on God Valley hurt this man, it hurt his heart, and so we shall see what this is. If Baby Shanks was shown in the panel where Garp is chasing the 3 future Yonkos, it would have been a historical event of all 4 Yonkos in a single panel together. There is still time for this to happen. God Valley is unprecedented in that we do actually have all 4 of the original 4 emperors of the sea all in one location, and not just 4, we have more than 4. With Blackbeard in total, we actually have 5 of the 7 people who would officially go on to hold the title of Emperor of the Sea, as well as the father and grandfather of Luffy, our 6th Emperor. And I swear, something must be happening with Buggy somewhere. As a reminder, he is the exact same age as Shanks, so he is a baby right now, and the Roger Pirates also picked him up somewhere. We don't know where. But if it is also God Valley, there could be a connection to all 7 emperors, making God Valley the most formative historical event that has ever happened according to the not history books, because it isn't there. I was watching the anime yesterday, and I was wondering if Bonnie could turn Brooke back to normal by aging him to where he was younger. She probably can, but I don't think it'll happen, because Oda's been very careful with how he uses, or really, how he doesn't use Bonnie, as her powers are ridiculous. You gotta keep her constrained, or things are gonna get out of hand. But the fun part about the potential of this is that we don't even have to make Brooke look younger. What Bonnie could do is give Brooke any number of alternate future forms where he kept his body. But aside from just being fun, the only way I could see this happening would be if it was something to do with Gunko. Mr. Brooke has already started to break through to her, which he doesn't realize, and neither does she really. But perhaps one way to solidly break whatever control Imu has over Gunko would be to give Brooke a flesh and blood form and appear the same as Gunko remembers him. That's the only way I can see it happening, because there's really no benefit to Brooke otherwise. Giving him the rest of his body back at this point would just be weighing down his fighting style with all of that meat. Although I do feel like it might be against the spirit of One Piece in general for Brooke to need to have his body to get through to Gunko, as the more touching way to resolve this would be for Gunko to realize that it's Brooke, even though he is nothing but bones now, as the spirit of Brooke is still there, etc. Do you anticipate that Loki's future role is gonna be significant? Because from what I understood and heard from Rocksteady's Beck himself about the legendary Devil Fruit of Elbaf, is that if King Harold ate this fruit, he would be able to destroy the world government. So that understanding is not quite correct. Harold and the fruit, they are just components of the plan. And as a reminder, in chapter 1156, Rock said there were 2 devil fruits he was looking for. One of those fruits is still a pretty massive mystery to us. We haven't touched on that at all, but we should before the flashback ends. Maybe, actually, I don't know. Maybe we won't. But the second is implied to be Elbaf's legendary devil fruit, which Rox didn't even want for himself. He needed King Harold to eat it in order to unlock its true power. But even having Harold with the fruit isn't good enough, as it was Captain John, actually, the now theorized father of Eustace Kid, who pointed out that Rox also needed the ancient Galilar giants. And it's only with those 3 to 4 things that Rox can actually succeed. He needs the ancient clan of the giants, he needs Harold to have eaten the legendary devil fruit, and the third thing he needs is that second mystery devil fruit. But that is why Rox said that Elbaf was the key to, quote, taking down the Holy Land, which we know doesn't happen, and I suppose if Loki was to inherit the will of Rox, then that would theoretically go on to be his goal. Although even he, if he has eaten the devil fruit, would still need 2 more things to make that happen. And I should also say that bringing down the Holy Land is not the goal of the Straw Hats, at least not at the moment anyway. Currently, they have no reason to be bothered in any way with the Holy Land yet, and that's one reason why asking about Loki's future significance isn't a bad question. I know to some people this probably sounded like a stupid question. Is Loki gonna be significant? Probably. But the will of Rox and the will of Luffy are not necessarily aligned. Plus, this story could end with Loki coming to the conclusion that Harold's path was the correct one, and we'd end up with Loki being another monarch left behind, thus dampening his future relevance. And at the moment, yes, Loki does feel like one of the most important characters in modern day One Piece, but I don't know how much that guarantees his role going forward either, not beyond Elbaf or even on Elbaf. And most of my doubts are probably a bit trauma-based, and they come directly from Yamato on Wano. When we met Yamato, it was very much the same vibe as Loki. With Yamato, it was, oh my god, here is one of the most important people to have ever existed, because we've got the child of a world-renowned figure who has read the journal of Kozuki Oden, and claims to want to set sail with the Straw Hats to finish what it is Oden started. And then Well, not a whole lot. And even during the Wano arc, there wasn't a whole lot. If you track Yamato's path during the raid on Onigashima, not a lot really happens. Yamato first decides to protect Momonosuke, but then abandons that to help Luffy, and then abandons that to help defuse the weapon stockpile, which is an issue that was solved by Big Mom's defeat and not Yamato. And then Yamato kind of runs out of things to do and becomes a cheerleader for Momonosuke until Kaido is ultimately beaten, and then doesn't even join the crew afterwards. Everything that Yamato set out to do, everything Yamato said, was either abandoned or completed by someone else. And I'm really hoping that Loki doesn't get the same treatment. However, I'm pretty confident that he won't, because Oda has designed this man for action. You do not create a character design this cool to not use it in some sort of amazing way. Whereas Yamato has a very standard feminine Oda design, and Oda likes to keep those designs safe and over here and not punch them too much. But it does look like that Oda is setting Loki up to be extremely relevant to the dawn of the world through the legendary Devil Fruit business, I think. Because look, I don't know, at the time, Odin's journal felt just as relevant as this as well. So I don't know, we will see. Do you think we will see how Sword was created on God Valley? Kind of like the reward incentive Garp will get for his contribution? I don't know, because God Valley, it might be a bit too early for Sword. We don't know exactly when Sword was created, but if you look at its membership, we see Kobe, Helmeppo, Hibari, Prince Gru, Kujaku, etc. It is a very this generation organization, with its current oldest member, Diaz Drake, the captain of Sword, still only being 33 years old. I'm also not hugely confident that Sword is a creation that was pioneered by Garp. If it was, you'd think you might call it Fist or something. And I do like the ideas that Sword might be more linked to Fujitora, because in the world of One Piece right now, Sword isn't a very well-known organization, which speaks to some recency, and it might have been one of Fujitora's conditions to become a Marine Admiral, to have the power to create an organization like this at his discretion. And as for Garp's involvement, when Vice Admiral Dole is speaking to Garp, she states that she assumed Garp had permission from high up to pick a fight with an Emperor of the Sea before setting sail to Hachinosu to rescue Kobe. If Garp was actually involved in Sword, he wouldn't need that permission. He could just do whatever he wanted as he saw fit. And really, I think that Garp is the model for the standard Marine, the one who fits within the organization rather than the one who goes rogue, even though that's exactly what he does. His hero status is more like the ideal law-abiding Marine. However, the argument I would make for Garp starting Sword is that it would form part of liberation within the Marines, perhaps not for Garp himself, but laying the groundwork for future generations to pursue their own beliefs of justice. Thoughts on the card game? Right, so the One Piece card game, it has gotten a lot better. When it was first released, I absolutely trashed this TCG because the cards themselves, they were garbage. Most of them were pretty horribly designed and just use awful screenshots as their art. Like this is my personal favorite, most hated example. This right here is the Mako card. Nothing about this is appealing. It's a horrible screenshot and it's got a text box on the card with no text on it. And that's how a lot of cards were in the base set of One Piece. Just found another one. Here's Suru. And she also looks shit. And to put my cards on the table here, how a TCG looks is extremely important to me. It is just as, if not more important than how the game actually plays, because I need to like what it is I'm looking at. And to be fair to the One Piece TCG, these days it does seem like almost every card has beautiful custom art and the game has really evolved. Right now, the only thing that stops me from getting heavily invested into it is that there is no online play. Well, there is, but it's fan-made and honestly, like, good job for doing it, but it looks awful. And what keeps me invested in other games like Pokemon and Magic the Gathering is that they have their official online clients where I can easily hop into games because I don't do anything in real life anymore. I'm in my mid-30s. I don't go outside. So until something like that gets released for the One Piece TCG, I just can't see myself playing it. How do you think red-haired Shanks will get the other rubbings? Will the Mink tribe just say, oh yeah, here you go? So right now, Shanks has the Poneglyph rubbings that Eustace Kid had, past tense, which he got from Wano and Whole Cake Island. And let's say that Shanks did have a way to get to Zo. That's not impossible, because he does appear to have a mink on his crew, which is this talking monkey dude. And if Shanks were to show up on Zo, I can't imagine that the minks would be hostile to him. And I was about to say this is because both Nekomamushi and Inuarashi knew Shanks as a child. They were all aboard Roger's ship together. But those two stayed on Wano, and now Carrot is the supreme mink overlord. Even then, given that Carrot's mentor Pedro had a connection to Roger, it seems likely that the Minks would be pretty friendly with the Red Hair Pirates, and I don't see why they wouldn't let Shanks see the Road Poneglyph. Here's the thing though, that is the boring answer to this problem. We don't conjure fun drama through friendly meetings, and assuming we count Zoe out as an option for storytelling reasons, Shanks then has two options remaining to attain that copy of the Road Poneglyph, which is to either take it from Blackbeard, who more than likely took Law's copy, or to take Luffy's copy. Because at some point this Poneglyph business is going to force a conflict between emperors. And the onus really is on Shanks because he feels like the front runner at the moment, but he's actually the emperor in the second worst position. The Straw Hat Pirates have a copy of all three Road Poneglyphs we know of, Zoe, Wano, and Whole Cake Island, and in theory so do the Blackbeard Pirates. They likely took Zoe and Wano from Law. Kuzan and Van Alga also went to Whole Cake Island personally to abduct Charlotte Pudding. To abduct her for the purpose of reading these poneglyphs, that is, and so it would be insane if they did not also get a copy of Big Mom's Road Poneglyph while they were there. So it really is up to Shanks to make something happen here, because at the moment he's behind in this race. I'm sick of people calling Kaido a hypocrite for saying Haki transcends all while having a broken devil fruit. Too many people are forgetting that Rock saw teenage fruitless Kaido as strong enough to fight alongside Whitebeard, Shiki, and Big Mom, who all had their own broken devil fruits because of his strength and Haki alone. What I would add to that is that Kaido was also treated as the punching bag of the Rock's pirates. He's only shown equally alongside those characters because we know that he is a character that goes on to become prominent. So he did have strength and he did have some Hakis, but he was the absolute bottom of the Rock pile. Also, Kaido's line tends to be either misinterpreted or misremembered, and look, I'll admit I do this on purpose sometimes, because I enjoy the agenda of Kaido being a hypocrite and telling Luffy that his awakened sun god fruit isn't all that great because he's suddenly jelly that his own fruit doesn't look so amazing anymore. But what Kaido actually said was, abilities alone cannot conquer the world, because only Haki can transcend all. And there's two parts to this. Firstly, the word conquer. What Kaido is saying to Luffy is entirely irrelevant because of this framing. Luffy said to Rayleigh that he is not going to conquer anything. The Pirate King is the man who is the most free, which is an assessment that Roger would have agreed with. And the part two of this is that Kaido is using Roger as his metric. Roger wasn't a fruit user and therefore only Haki can conquer the world. But Roger didn't conquer the world either. And in general, Kaido just doesn't get it. He's not on the same wavelength as either Luffy or Roger, and so his criterial assessment is not to be trusted, especially since the most important factor may turn out to be neither Haki nor devil fruits or even a combination of the two. The key to it could be a different power like the voice of all things, or something much, much deeper than all of that, something that has to be innate in a person, and something that cannot be accessed by people who consider themselves to be conquerors. So with all of that said, again, I just find it funny that Kaido saw a devil fruit more powerful than his, and he threw a tantrum. Yeah, well, Straw Hat fruits don't matter that much anyway. And then he got punched into some magma, and he never spoke again. Cyberspace Fellow, do you think there's a case to be made with the idea that Emu could be a Klabautermann? We know that Joy Boy broke a promise to the fisherman, and that the Noah has some sort of importance in the history. Interesting. I think we could do this. And this might be the first decent explanation I've seen for Emu existing as just a silhouette. And I guess we're implying that Emu would be the Klabautermann of the Noah, a ship that has been abandoned at the bottom of the ocean and not yet used for the purpose it was designed for. And instead of being manifested by love and care, Emu is manifested by neglect and other assorted bad things. It even gives Emu a solid motivation to be drowning the world in order to have everyone else suffer the same fate that he is. But it could also potentially tie into the existence of Davy Jones, another mythical figure cursed to spend eternity at the bottom of the ocean. There are two things though. First is how or why did the Klabautermann take on the Nerona name, and why is Emu so obsessed with Lily? I could potentially answer the second one, as maybe Lily was the Usopp in the Noah equation and wanted to take care of the ship even though for whatever reason it couldn't be used, and that is why Emu has this Lily fixation. I don't know, but I am liking this idea a lot better than Emu being a straight up sea demon though. Do you think the Thousand Sunny has its own Klabautermann? If so, how do you think it can help the Straw Hats in future adventures? I think it has to, because the Straw Hats have given the Sunny just as much love as they did the Going Merry. And in the episode of Merry, Toei made a very bold decision to actually show the Sunny's Klabautermann, which looks exactly like Merry's but with a lovely golden cloak. And this is not canon at this stage, we've not seen it in the manga, but it is definitely my headcanon at the moment. But here's something that might be a bit wild and a bit depressing, as today, right now, we are almost exactly 20 years from the date of the funeral of the Going Merry. That chapter happened in October 2006. So next year is going to be the 20th anniversary of the death of the Going Merry. And by the time that One Piece is over, we will have spent at least twice as long with the Thousand Sunny as we did with the Going Merry. And I feel like it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't get to see the will of Sunny playing an important role at some stage. Because just like Merry, Sunny is a vital crew member, and as its name implies, the Thousand Sunny deserves its time to shine. What really happened to Roxy Xebec, a man who has been so successfully erased from all of the histories that we don't even know how he exited this world or even if he exited? Some fans insist that they've spotted rocks hidden by Oda in the present-day manga, whilst others have been following the linguistic breadcrumbs left by Oda to solve the puzzle of the ironic fate of the aptly named rocks. And meanwhile, there's the most sinister option of all, which is that he is still influencing the events of this planet through the avatar of Marshall D. Teach. There is one thing that we know for sure about Rox, and that was that he was very untrustworthy. To the point where it's even difficult to trust the concept of his death. I will not trust that corpse until I've seen it. Charlotte Lin made a point of stating that Rox was an extremely untrustworthy scoundrel, and ever since the God Valley incident, each of the remaining Rox pirates have developed something of a betrayal complex, which may have spawned from Rox himself. At the time of this recording, the earliest record we have of Mr. Rox Xebec was his visit to Elbaf, where a young Prince Loki challenged him, and Rox proceeded to beat the ever-loving crap out of little Loki, who is actually very big, so much bigger than Rox. But it was a massacre without mercy, and Rox even ended up stabbing Loki for good measure, with Whitebeard saying, "Rox, mate, you took things a bit too far there," and Rox simply replying with, "Shut up, Newgate." That is one of only 5 lines of dialogue that Rox Xebec has had in the series to date, with another one of those lines being, "What?" And as of episode 1130, we've heard Rox's voice in the anime, and he has now spoken 40% of his total lines in the series. And to be honest, his voice, it doesn't sound like anything particularly special. It's just giving me very generic old man, which is odd because this voice was given to a young Rox, or I guess an assumed young Rox. We don't know how old he was. But what we do know is that his ambition was to become the king of the world, the Sekai no All. And what's very interesting about that is to date, Rox has been a Silhouette exclusive character. The anime has given his appearances a bit more definition, but the manga keeps him completely emblackened just like Emu. And on the rare occasion where we do get a close-up of Rox, such as during the brief Loki flashback, we see him in complete darkness with one eye open, which is how Emu close-ups are often handled by Oda. There is some connective tissue happening here. I'm not saying that Rox is related to Emu in any biological way, but their ambitions are definitely related. Rox wants to become king of the world, and Emu has already become king of the world. And the fact that to date Rox is often drawn in a similar way to Emu shows us that Rox very much had what it takes to sit at the tippy top of the world. And should history had taken even a slightly different turn, he could very well be the king of the world right now. As currently we know that the Rox pirates operated for at least 6 years, and according to Sengoku, the group formed to, quote, make one big score, which makes the Rox sound like the fictional pirate equivalent of Oceans 11, 12, or even 13. And Sengoku also refers to them as the strongest crew in the world. But with this line also came what I'm going to call a curious piece of doubt. The Rox pirates, the strongest crew in the world, were wiped out at an island called God Valley, according to the news reports. That last line there, that gives me so much doubt, because if there is one thing we've learned along this extremely long journey, it's that we cannot always trust the news in this world. world. It is made by a bird. So what really happened on God Valley? What didn't the news report? And while Sengoku does go on to say, of those rare pirates with the initial D, though he is no longer alive to speak of it, is there a way that rocks could still be very much alive? The answer, until proven otherwise, is yes. Yes, and then a lot more words, which I will now proceed to speak. There's a myriad of Rock's conspiracy theories out there in the fan base. He is a very fun character to think about, and from the very moment we got a silhouette of Rock's, thousands of men with thousands of eyes scoured through all of One Piece to find any clues regarding this here silhouette, and something quite fascinating was found in chapter 535, which was during the Impel Down arc. On level 5, the Freezing Hell, we see a frozen prisoner fitting the silhouette image of Rocks, and another prisoner commenting, is he dead, or is he preserved for the future? And if you take all of this in isolation, which I am, it does sound rather ominous, and could be yet another example of Oda's superb foreskinning by planting Rocks right here and setting him up for revival in the future, preserving him for the future. Unfortunately, when this isn't taken in isolation, this guy does actually have a name. Oda called him Kairokureo, which literally translates as give me a hand warmer, and even if he was unnamed, it would still make very little sense to stick Rocks on level 5, because level 6, the Eternal Hell, is where prisoners are taken to be forgotten by the world and said to be erased from history. And if Blackbeard hadn't already sacked and raided level 6, that is exactly where I would expect a man erased by history to be. But he isn't, and so Impel Down probably isn't the right place to look. But perhaps the secret of Rocks is very much hidden in plain sight with his name, as there is a very fun idea that Rocks was subject to a very classic Oda ironic fate by being turned to stone on God Valley by a previous user of Boa Hancock's Devil Fruit. Several characters in One Piece have been named for no other reason other than to put a fatesome full stop on their lives. Kozuki Odin is our go-to example of this. Odin was of course born to boil, and Oda only named Odin Odin because Oda was inspired to create a character based on Ishikawa Goemon, the Japanese Robin Hood, who was executed in a boiling pot, and in a rather morbid twist of culture, this resulted in a new style of Japanese bath being created called the Goemon bath. And in fact, this also applies to the Impel Down prisoner we just discussed. When he popped out of his mother's birth port and was named Kairokureo, he was pretty much fated to freeze to death. And all of these acts by Oda are what I like to refer to as punishment. But there is a lot more to this Rocks idea than haha, wouldn't it be funny if? Because it would also go a long way towards explaining why Blackbeard was ever so enthusiastic about taking the opportunity to invade Amazon Lily to acquire Boa Hancock's Devil Fruit. When the warlords were dissolved, Blackbeard dropped all of his cherry pies and immediately set sail to Amazon Lily. And when he did get there, he said, "I've been hoping to get your powers," as if the Meru no Mi plays an integral role in his master plan. And so if Rocks was petrified, Blackbeard could be focusing on Boa Hancock in order to undo the petrification, probably not requiring Hancock herself. What we do right is we knock her off a rather tall cliff and then pass the fruit on to a Blackbeard loyalist to revive Rocks. Now, this theory does have some issues. What goes in favor of this idea is that Boa Hancock confirmed that those petrified remain petrified even after the death of the user who enacted it. However, what she also said is that, "Kill me and your followers will remain petrified. The next wielder of the fruit cannot undo the spell." Meaning that if Rocks is a Rocks turned out to be the direction that we were going in, Blackbeard still wouldn't be able to revive him. The tricky thing is, it's very difficult to know whether or not Boa Hancock was telling the truth. It could be a raw bluff to convince Blackbeard not to kill her. But more often than not, Oda doesn't really lie to the readers through statements like this. What the characters say is as much for the audience as it is for the other characters who are things are being said to. I'm not doing it again. So it would be rather unusual, albeit not unprecedented, for this to be false. However, if it is true, then that is also quite curious in and of itself, because for Hancock to know this, it would mean that she must have encountered another life form petrified by a previous user and tried to undo it. And you know, what would really help is if we saw Blackbeard's reaction to the statement, which in the manga we don't, and in the anime what he does is he just keeps and as he does, he delivers the extremely cold anime-only line, which is, "Your power is amazing, but your neck is so thin." But ultimately, Blackbeard frighteningly casually decides that he's gonna need to kill Hancock despite his crew members being petrified, which speaks to one of two things. Either Blackbeard has such careless disregard for his crew, which that's probably true either way. In this case, he was was very willing to sacrifice 2 of his Titanic captains though, Vasco Shot and Katarina Devon. It's either that or it says to me that Blackbeard was confident that Boa Hancock was lying. And Blackbeard isn't someone to be ignored when it comes to matters of fictional fruit. Aside from Dr. Vegapunk, Blackbeard may be the world's greatest authority on devil fruits. He has studied them extensively and he is purposely collecting certain abilities to feed to his officers. So he might even know more about this fruit than Hancock does, especially if it's part of his ultimate plan to go and grab it. And this fruit could even have been one of the 4 fruit powers that we haven't seen from the prize chest during the native hunting competition on God Valley, and then consumed by someone on the island to put a permanent stop to the rocks. Although weirdly enough, the most likely candidate to perform that would have been a Rocks pirate. The group were always infighting and killing one another, and again, Rocks was viewed as rather untrustworthy by even his own crew. The whole situation is just begging for a mutiny, and it could be that this is where the Rocks pirates discovered Xebec's actual ambition, which no longer coincided with their personal goals, or it could have been done by a Marine or even a Holy Knight. Someone who had a good 18 to 23 years to die before the fruit would end up in possession of the world nobles, where it was force-fed to Boa Hancock. It's the sort of thing I can see happening, because even in the story as we know it, it took both Roger and Garp to take on Rocks, and so there is a fictional reality where even those two may not have been enough. Could nothing stand up to the power of Rocks, and was the only solution to petrify him? If so, this could make what Sengoku says technically true. If Rocks is petrified, then he's not currently alive, and he certainly cannot speak of anything. But this would be the most horrifying outcome because it could mean a revival of Prime Rocks. We're not talking lurking legends like Garp, Rayleigh, and Scopogaban, all 3 of whom have commented on how rusty they've become because of their old. We're not talking about them. We would be seeing Rocks at the peak of his power, which is cool, very cool, but the only thing I don't like about it is that it would kind of rob Blackbeard of his role of being the final cherry pie antagonist man. He'd almost go on to become a lackey of Rocks, which isn't really his style at all. But what does happen to be Blackbeard's style is pretty much everything we know about Rocks himself. At the very least, Marshall D. Teach is the recipient of the inherited will of Rocks D. Xebec, which was made clear by the name of his flagship being the Saber of Xebec, which if you look at the one shot we have of Rocks engaged in battle combat against Roger, he is wielding a saber. So it's very interesting that Blackbeard knows that information, or in fact, any information, because Rocks was supposedly erased from history. And you could say that, hey, man on the internet, maybe Blackbeard learned about Rocks from Whitebeard telling his stories. But it's been pretty firmly established that none of the former Rocks pirates talk about their time together. So it's unlikely that Blackbeard picked up much, if anything, from Whitebeard. And joining Whitebeard in the first place also wasn't a coincidence. Even when he was a teeny tiny pie child, this was all part of the master plan. Blackbeard joined them to search for the Yami Yami no Mi, thinking that Whitebeard would give him the best chance of eventually finding it, which is disturbingly sound logic based on an incredibly detailed knowledge of fictional fruits that a 10 to 14-year-old orphan just so happened to have. So at the time of God Valley, Blackbeard would have been 2 years old, which I point out because there's a bunch of theories out there that state that Blackbeard is a reincarnation of Rocks. But unless Oda himself is lying about Blackbeard's age, that's probably not it. Although there is some argument to be made that Blackbeard's given age could be false due to Ace's line in chapter 440. In the official Viz translation, Ace says to Blackbeard, "You've been around for a real long time," which, not suspicious in and of itself. But that's because English doesn't really convey the meaning of the sentence, and in Japanese it is much more ominous and ambiguous. In fact, at the time, current official translator Stephen Paul took to the Oolong Park forums to try and clarify what Ace was saying here, and he said that it was literally, "You've walked double the life of another/a person," which could simply be referring to the fact that Blackbeard is stated to be twice as old as Ace. But Stephen also identified that it was said in a very suspicious way, and it could have a double meaning alluding to Blackbeard's innate abilities. It's a very long explanation, it's almost 800 words, but the TLDR is that either could work, implying that Blackbeard could have been living longer than we have suspected. And either way, Blackbeard is an existence who seems to have been born for the purpose of carrying out this plan, meaning that he was either groomed by someone in, the non-touchy way to inherit the will of Rocks and given a plan to carry out, or that something significantly weirder is happening, such as, say, the actual spirit of Rocks D. Xebec inhabiting Blackbeard's body, and that being responsible for his stark personality shifts, where at some point Blackbeard can be a fearless leader eager to jump into the blender of fate, and at other times flee like an Usopp-level coward. The brave brave Teach we see being rocks in command, whilst the coward is the real Teach. But this would likely require a Devil Fruit ability akin to Brooke's Soul Fruit to make happen. There are definitely simpler ideas which I tend to prefer, but the issue of using Occam's razor with Blackbeard is that the facts that we have about him are already so far beyond the realm of simplicity. With that said, Blackbeard being a clone of Rocks has also been posed, a more rotund and dare I say botched early clone, like how Edward Weevil is a clone of Whitebeard that got left in the oven for a bit too long, or maybe Blackbeard was a clone that was botched beyond all understanding, which is why he allegedly cannot sleep and why his body is able to absorb multiple fruit powers. But then of course there is the most straightforward thought of all, that Marshall D. Teach is the son of Rox Diesebeck, but didn't take his father's name for obvious reasons. Kind of like how Ace didn't take Roger's family name, and if this was true, then it would make the Ace versus Blackbeard situation hit a lot harder in retrospect, given that what we would now be viewing are the sons of Roger and Rox continuing this inter-D conflict. But one thing that always gets me about Blackbeard is how he gathered his crew. It's extremely similar to how the Rox Pirates were formed. The Rox Pirates were obtained through a search of raw strength. It would appear that Rox didn't care so much for the individual attitudes or goals of the crew. All he wanted was that sweet punch power. And so the Rox Pirates were formed as an ongoing battle royale. Even once you were accepted in the crew, murder between crew members was apparently rather common and even encouraged. Like how Blackbeard encouraged himself to murder Thatch because that's just what you do. And Blackbeard did very much the same thing when he stormed into Impel Down and made the level 6 prisoners engage in a death battle to see who would be offered the opportunity to join him. Impel Down was the perfect location for this because the world government had very conveniently and very helpfully assembled a legion of the most powerful pirates in recent history all in one location, and all without a choice but to participate in whatever the crap it is Blackbeard wanted to do. Plus, when Blackbeard went under the blanket to do what he did with Whitebeard, it was noted by Shiryu that if this failed, the crew would immediately disband, like the Rocks did on God Valley. And when Blackbeard was recruiting Kuzan, he initially refused the offer to join because Kuzan didn't trust any of them, a reasonable opinion, but Blackbeard just replied, "Easy now, easy. Have you got the wrong idea about pirates? Nobody said we were all the best of friends here. The only thing pirates need is an alignment of interests," which is, again, how the Rocks Pirates found themselves becoming a cohort to complete whatever that one big score was. And I don't really know where I fall on the spectrum of Rocks theories. I don't think that he is Blackbeard, but a part of Blackbeard, that may be possible. Because unlike Roger, who accepted his end with grace, Rocks could have clung on to some degree of life and may have been influencing Marshall D. Teach to carry out his plan ever since. But you let me know where you fall on the Rocks theory spectrum in the comments below.